Jihun had walked through 20 years of blood and silence without flinching once. In the underworld of Seoul, his name was not spoken above a whisper. His face was a sentence. His presence was a verdict. Men who had stared down loaded barrels trembled when his motorcade rolled past. He had built his throne not with ambition alone, but by surgically removing every soft thing inside himself. Every memory, every feeling, every flicker of the boy he used to be, until all that remained was the sharp black suit, the cold eyes, and the dark thicket of ink that climbed his neck like a warning written in his own skin. But on this morning, the most dangerous man in Korea met something he had no protocol for. She was barely 7 years old, a blue shirt, hair pulled into a neat little bun, and she was following him. Not hiding, not hesitating, not afraid. She just walked, small sneakers tapping the sunlit pavement of Gangnam like she had every right to be there, keeping pace behind his motorcade with a calm, haunting purpose that made his lead bodyguard reach for his radio before he even understood why. Seok's guards had removed grown men from his path without breaking a sweat. Rival scouts, undercover officers, journalists with death wishes. Not one of them had ever looked at Seok the way this child did, wide-eyed, unblinking, holding something tightly in her small, clenched fist. Nobody knew her name yet. Nobody knew where she came from. And nobody, not one man in that motorcade, could explain why she kept choosing him. Most of them thought she was lost. One thought she was bait. Seok said nothing. He just watched her through the tinted rear window, jaw tight, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Unease. Stay with us, because this is not a story about crime. This is a story about a monster who looked into the eyes of a child and saw exactly what he had become. And you will not believe what she had been carrying for him all along. Seok had not survived 20 years at the top of Seoul's underworld by ignoring patterns. A rival's car parked twice on the same street, a waiter who refilled his glass before it was half empty, a phone that rang once and stopped. These were the kinds of patterns that had kept him breathing while better men went into the ground. His mind was a machine built for exactly this, cataloging the ordinary until the dangerous revealed itself. So when Jihun mentioned the girl on the third morning, Seok already knew. He had clocked her on the first day. Tuesday had started the way every Tuesday started. 6:45. Espresso standing up. The city assembling itself 30 floors below like a country that owed him rent. By 7, his motorcade was moving south through Gangnam, 3 black vehicles, tinted, swept for devices that morning, running the usual staggered formation through traffic. Seok sat in the rear of the lead car reviewing acquisition documents that required his signature before 9. Jihun sat across from him, quiet in the way only a man who has served a dangerous person for a long time knows how to be quiet. It was the quality of the light that made him notice her. Morning sun in Seoul in late spring hits the streets at a low angle, and it turns everything caught in it briefly golden, the chrome of passing taxis, the glass faces of storefronts, the white of a pedestrian's shirt. The motorcade was paused at a signal on Dawson-Darrow when something in his peripheral vision caught that light differently. A figure, small, moving at a pace that didn't match the crowd around it, not hurrying with the commuters, not drifting like a tourist. Moving with intention, in the same direction as his car, at a distance of perhaps 40 meters. He looked once, filed it, looked back at his documents. Children wandered. Children followed bright things. It meant nothing. But the machine in his mind had taken the photograph. Wednesday, she was outside the building in Seoul. Same blue shirt. Same neat bun sitting high on her head like something her mother had done carefully that morning. Same pace, not fast, not slow, calibrated to something only she could calculate. His outer security had clocked her by mid-morning and logged it as a stray child in the vicinity. D1 had noted her in the perimeter report with no flag attached. Seok read the report that evening. He read the word stray and felt something move in the back of his mind that he didn't examine closely. He authorized no action. He went to bed at 11. He slept 4 hours, which was normal. On Thursday morning, When the motorcade turned onto a Gyeongjang Road, and he saw the blue shirt 40 meters back in the side mirror, before Jihun had even looked up from his tablet, Baeum Seok set down his pen. 3 days, same child, same distance, same wordless, unhurried certainty. This was a pattern. Have D1 remove her from the area, he said. Not send her home, not speak to her, remove her from the area. The precision was intentional. D1 stepped out at the next light. 300 pounds of controlled weight moving through pedestrian traffic like water parting around a stone. Baeum Seok watched through the rear window without appearing to watch, a skill he had cultivated for longer than most people in his life had been alive. D1 crouched, said something. The girl's head tilted, a single, slow degree, the way a person tilts their head when they are listening to something they already know the answer to. Her eyes moved past D1's shoulder, past the trailing vehicle, past the second car, and landed with an accuracy that should not have been possible through 3 layers of tinted glass and 40 meters of morning traffic, directly on Baeum Seok. His jaw tightened. D1 straightened, returned, sat down, the door closed. A full 4 seconds of silence passed before his security chief said, with the particular careful neutrality of a man delivering unwelcome news to a person who does not tolerate unwelcome news, "She won't leave, sir." Baeum Seok said nothing. Outside, the signal changed. The motorcade moved. And in the mirror, growing smaller but not stopping, not turning, not reacting to the size or the guns or the unmistakable authority of what she had just walked up to, the girl kept going. Why wasn't she afraid of the guns? He didn't ask it out loud, but the machine asked it, and the machine did not let questions go unanswered. He ordered a full sweep that night. Jihun ran it quietly, rival syndicate movements, known surveillance operations in the Gangnam and Seocho districts, any recent intelligence regarding the use of children in proximity operations. The underworld had used innocents as proximity tools before. It was a method he found personally reprehensible, which was a distinction he rarely made about the methods of others. He found it reprehensible because it was effective, and effective things that he hadn't authorized made him dangerous to be around. The sweep returned nothing. No movement from the Blasian network, no whisper from the northern families, no flag from his contacts inside the police corridors, nothing that placed a child deliberately in his path for any known operational purpose. Which left the possibility he trusted least of all, that she had come on her own. He stepped out of the car himself on Thursday. No signal to the detail. Simply opened the door at a red light 2 blocks from the morning's first meeting and walked back through traffic with his hands loose at his sides, and his face the way his face always was, which was to say, a closed door with no handle on the outside. The girl saw him coming from 30 meters. She did not run. Most adults, upon realizing that the man walking toward them was Baeum Seok, made an immediate unconscious decision to be somewhere else. It wasn't always about recognition. Sometimes it was just physics, the way he occupied space, the way the air around him seemed to have a lower temperature, the way the ink on his neck moved when he moved, like a living thing. People stepped aside. People looked down. People found reasons to face the other direction. The girl watched him close the distance with the same expression she'd worn every morning, open, steady, and carrying something underneath it that he could not name. Not fear, not performance, something heavier than both. He stopped in front of her, looked down, she looked up. Up close, she was smaller than he'd registered from the car. Blue shirt, slightly worn at the left cuff, one shoelace tied tighter than the other, a small scratch healing on her right cheekbone. Her hair was in a bun, and 2 strands had escaped near her left ear, and no one had put them back. She looked like a ghost from his past, not her face, not her age, something in the posture, the straightness of it, the refusal in it. The "I have decided and I am here and you cannot" chain, that in the set of her small shoulders. He had stood like that once, in a doorway, a long time ago, before he understood what doors like that led to. He pushed the memory down before it fully formed. "Who sent you?" He said it in Korean first, level, then in English, watching her eyes. Her chin came up, not defiance, something more precise than defiance. Certainty. And the fist she'd been holding closed since the first morning opened slowly in front of him. The locket sat in her palm like an accusation. Old silver, nearly black with age. The chain broken and coiled beneath it. And on its face, 3 engraved characters worn thin by years but still legible to anyone who knew what they were reading. Baemsiak knew what he was reading. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a very loud thing occurs without making any sound. Behind him, he heard one of his guards shift weight. He heard Jihun's door open, then stop. He heard the city continuing its indifferent noise, traffic, wind, the distant percussion of a construction site, and all of it seemed to be coming from very far away. The locket had belonged to a man whose name Baemsiak had not spoken in 19 years. A man who had stood between Baemsiak and his first real acquisition of power, and who had therefore ceased to be a man in Baemsiak's accounting and become instead an obstacle. Obstacles got removed. That was the arithmetic of the life he had chosen, and he had made peace with the arithmetic before he was 30, and he had not revisited it since. How did a child have this? He looked up from the locket, back into her eyes, and the question that followed was worse, the one the machine in his mind assembled slowly and placed in front of him with the care of someone setting down something fragile. Who are you to him? He did not ask it. He straightened. He looked at Jihun, who was standing by the open car door with an expression Baemsiak had never seen on him before, which was its own kind of information. Find out where she sleeps tonight, Baemsiak said, quiet, precise. Everything, how long, with who, don't touch anything. Jihun nodded once, the way he nodded when he understood that a question had just become a priority. Baemsiak turned back to his car, settled into the seat, picked up his pen. He did not look in the mirror. He told himself this was because he had already gathered all the relevant data from the encounter, and there was no operational need for further observation. The machine did not contradict him. But somewhere in the part of him that was not a machine, the part he had been burying since before the ink on his neck was dry, something had recognized her. Not her face, not her name, the thing she was carrying. The thing underneath the wide eyes and the steady chin and the broken locket and the certainty that had no business existing in someone her size. She was carrying something she should never have had to carry alone. He knew the weight of it because he had carried it himself, at her age, in a doorway, before he understood what he was walking into. The pen moved across the document, his signature, clean, fast, final. The ink on his neck felt hot, like a fresh burn. Like a debt being called in from a direction he hadn't thought to guard. Jihun's report would come by midnight. It would tell him where she had been sleeping. It would tell him how long. And when Baemsiak read it, when he saw with his own eyes the place this child had been surviving, in the shadow of a building whose deed bore his organization's name, the arithmetic he had made peace with at 30 was going to stop adding up. But he didn't know that yet. He only knew that she had not flinched, that the locket was real, that her fist had been closed around it for 3 days, which meant she had been waiting, not wandering, not lost, not sent by anyone with a motive he could neutralize. Waiting. For him, specifically. And in 20 years, through every threat and negotiation and cold room and colder decision, no one had ever simply waited for GM Baemsiak. What did Jihun find when the report came back at midnight? And when Baemsiak reads the address, when he recognizes it, why does he sit for 11 minutes in a dark car without moving? Jihun's report arrived at 11:53. Baemsiak was still at his desk. He had not moved to the sitting area, had not loosened his tie, had not done any of the things a man does when he is winding down for the night. He was simply at the desk, in the light, with a glass of water he hadn't touched, and a city sprawled below him that belonged, in every way that mattered, to him. He read the report once, then he set it face down on the desk. Then he sat for 11 minutes without moving. The address in the report was a district warehouse in Mapogu. 4 stories, reinforced concrete, legitimate front operation running import logistics out of the ground floor. The upper levels were used for storage overflow, crates, equipment, things that moved in and out without attracting the kind of attention that required explanation. The deed was held by a subsidiary of a subsidiary, clean on paper, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Seok knew where to look because he had signed the original acquisition himself. 6 years ago, a Tuesday, he believed. He had signed many things on many Tuesdays, and this one had registered as nothing more significant than any other line in any other ledger. Jihun's operative had found the girl in a crawlspace on the building's 3rd floor, a gap between a false wall and the exterior concrete, perhaps 1.5 meters wide, accessible through a ventilation panel that had been carefully worked loose from its frame. Inside, a folded blanket, gray, washed recently by hand and dried stiff, a plastic water bottle refilled, a paperback book with no cover, and pinned to the concrete wall with a single piece of tape, a photograph. Jihun had not described the photograph. He had attached it. Seok had looked at it for a long time. The photograph showed a woman, late 30s, perhaps 40. She was seated in what appeared to be a hospital bed, though the setting was informal enough that it might have been a clinic, the kind that operated in the margins of the city's official health infrastructure, where people went when official was not an option. She was thin in the way that is not a choice. Her eyes were directed at whoever was holding the camera, and despite everything the photograph communicated about her condition, her expression was specific and deliberate. She was smiling for the child taking the picture. Seok had turned the report face down after that. 11 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Jihun. "The woman in the photograph," he said. "Find her." He did not sleep. By 4 a.m, he was in the back of a single unmarked car, no motorcade, no formation, moving through the pre-dawn streets of Mapogu with Jihun driving and no one else present. This was not standard. This was, in the operational vocabulary of his organization, the kind of departure from protocol that made security chiefs age faster than their years. Jihun said nothing about it. This was why Jihun had lasted. They parked half a block from the warehouse. Seok got out. He stood on the pavement in his black suit in the dark and looked at the building, his deed, his subsidiary's subsidiary. And he thought about the fact that a child had been sleeping in its walls for, according to Jihun's operative, approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks, while his motorcade passed within 100 meters on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He went inside alone. The crawlspace was exactly as Jihun had described it. Seok crouched at the entrance with a small flashlight and looked at the folded blanket, the water bottle, the coverless book. His knees were level with his chest. The space smelled of concrete dust and the faint soap smell of a child who had been working very hard to stay clean despite everything. The photograph was still pinned to the wall. He looked at it again in the flashlight's beam. The woman, the hospital bed, the smile that was entirely for someone else, someone small, someone standing just outside the frame holding a cheap camera or a borrowed phone, someone who had looked at this photograph every night before sleeping in a stranger's building, because it was the closest thing to home she had. He stayed in the crawlspace for longer than he intended. When he came out, Jihun was waiting in the corridor. His expression was the one he used when he had information and was calculating the right moment to deliver it. "The woman," Seok said. "Clinic in Yeongdeungpo. She's been there for 3 months." "The condition is," Jihun paused in the way that meant what followed was worse than what preceded it. "Advanced. The clinic is running on a charitable funding model. There's no formal insurance record for her. She appears to have been paying in cash until approximately 8 weeks ago." 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks before a child moved into a crawlspace in a Mapogu warehouse. Seok looked at the ventilation panel, at the faint marks on the floor where small feet had passed repeatedly over the same path, at the single piece of tape still stuck to the concrete wall where the photograph had been. He had taken the photograph when he left. He was not entirely sure why. He told himself it was evidence. The machine accepted this without comment. "And the locket," he said. This was the part Jihun had been holding. They went back to the car. Jihun pulled a folder from the document case he carried everywhere and placed it on the seat between them without speaking. Seok opened it. The locket was old. This he had established from the moment the girl opened her hand. What he had not established, standing on a Gyeogyang street in morning traffic with his guards watching, was its origin. He had recognized the engraving, 3 characters. His mind had supplied the name they belonged to instantly, the way the mind supplies a name when shown a face it has worked very hard to forget. The folder confirmed what he already knew and added what he hadn't. The man's name had been Michael Benjamin. He had been 41 years old at the time of his death, 19 years prior. He had run a small independent operation in what was then a transitional district, not large enough to be a serious rival, large enough to occupy territory that Seok's expanding network required. The removal had been clean, professional. Logged in the organization's internal records under a category that no longer existed in their current filing system, purged in a compliance restructuring 7 years ago. Michael Benjamin had not, to Seok's knowledge, had children. He had, according to the records Jihun had pulled through a contact in the civil registry, had a younger sister. Her name was listed as Elizabeth Benjamin. The woman in the photograph, the woman in the clinic in Yeongdeungpo, paying in cash until 8 weeks ago, currently listed in serious condition, shared that surname. Seok closed the folder. The city outside the car windows was beginning its earliest preparations for morning. A delivery truck, a street light cycling, the specific gray that precedes dawn in a city that never goes fully dark. Was this a message from the dead? Not a message. Michael Benjamin had not sent this child. Dead men sent nothing. But something had moved through 19 years like water finding the shape of a crack, slowly, inevitably, without malice, and arrived here. At his building, in his path, with his first victim's locket in its small clenched fist. Not sent. Delivered, by consequence, by the simple arithmetic of cause and time. He had ordered the removal of Michael 19 years ago and thought nothing more of the man's existence. He had not thought to ask about a sister. He had not thought to ask about anything that came after, because after was not his department. His department was the acquisition, and the acquisition was complete, and the ledger moved on. The ledger, it turned out, did not move on. The ledger had a 7-year-old girl who folded her uncle's locket into her fist every morning and followed his motorcade through the city until the man responsible for her mother's poverty and her uncle's death finally stopped walking long enough to look at her. She wasn't asking for his money. She was asking for his soul. And the worst part, the part the machine in his mind was having significant difficulty processing, was that she hadn't said a single word. He was back at his desk by 6. The espresso was made. The suit was the same suit, which had never happened before on a Thursday morning. Jihun had sent a secondary operative to maintain a discreet watch on the warehouse, not intervention, just observation. If the girl returned, he would know. At 6:42, Jihun called. "She's back," he said. "She went straight to the crawl space. She's been out. She's carrying something." "What?" A pause. The operative relaying information through Jihun, who was relaying it to him in real time. "Food," Jihun said. "She bought food. From the convenience store on the corner, she paid with coins." Seok set down the espresso. A child who had been sleeping in a crawl space for 6 weeks, watching over a mother she couldn't reach and following a man she had every reason to fear, had spent her coins on food this morning. Not on a phone call, not on a bus, on food. Because today was another day of following him, and she was going to need the energy for it, and she was going to do it regardless. He stood, picked up his jacket from the chair. "Send the car," he said. Jihun's pause lasted exactly 1 second, a record, for Jihun. "To the warehouse." "To the warehouse." "And when we arrive, sir, what are we?" "I'm going to talk to her," Seok said. "Properly, not in traffic." Another pause, shorter. "And if she won't talk?" Seok looked at the city below. At That the district in Mapogu he couldn't quite see from this angle but knew was there, had always been there, had always been his, had always been quietly holding things he hadn't thought to account for. "She'll talk," he said. "She's been trying to talk to me for 3 days." He ended the call. He picked up the photograph from the corner of his desk, where he'd placed it when he returned at 4 in the morning. The woman in the clinic bed. The smile that was entirely for the child behind the camera. The specific, devastating bravery of a mother performing peace for a daughter who needed to believe in it. He had done this, not with his hands, but the arithmetic didn't care about hands. The question, the one he had no operational category for, the one the machine couldn't file or purge or restructure away, arrived quietly, the way the worst questions always did. Who do you become when the ledger comes back? He put the photograph in his inside jacket pocket, against his chest, where the ink on his neck traced its thorns downward toward his heart. He went to meet the girl. And downstairs, in the lobby of the building whose name was on no public record but whose weight he carried in every room he entered, the car was already waiting. What does a 7-year-old say to the man who unmade her family? And why, when Baeum-seok finally hears it, when she finally speaks, does Jihun have to look away? The car arrived at the warehouse at 7:12. Baeum-seok had been in the building for 4 minutes before the girl came down from the crawlspace. He heard her before he saw her, the soft, careful placement of small feet on the stairwell, the pause on the second-floor landing where she would have checked the corridor before descending, the way she moved through a building she had been navigating alone for 6 weeks. Quietly, economically, like someone who had learned early that the space you occupied should never announce itself. He was standing in the ground floor corridor when she rounded the corner and stopped. She looked at him, he looked at her. He had brought no guards inside. This was deliberate. "Sit down," he said, and gestured to the crate beside the corridor wall. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then reconsidered and pulled a second crate level with hers and sat across from her with his forearms on his knees, which put his face at approximately her height. The photograph was in his inside pocket. The folder was in the car. Everything he needed for this conversation was already in the room. He placed the locket on the crate between them. Her eyes went to it immediately. Something moved through her face, not surprise, not relief, something quieter and more complex than either. Recognition. The way you look at something you surrendered on purpose and are now watching to see what the receiving party does with it. "Michael Benjamin," Baeum-seok said. "He was your mother's brother." Not a question. She understood it wasn't a question and answered it with a single, steady nod. "How did you get this?" She reached into the front pocket of her blue shirt and produced a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the crate beside the locket with the same deliberate care she'd used to open her fist 3 days ago in traffic. He unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in Korean, with occasional English words where the writer had apparently run out of the right Korean vocabulary. The natural, unself-conscious bilingualism of someone who thought in 2 languages simultaneously. The handwriting was a woman's, precise in the early lines, increasingly effortful toward the end. The way handwriting goes when the body is rationing its resources. He read it without expression. This took considerable effort. The letter explained that the locket had been Michael's, that it had been given to his sister, to Elizabeth, Martina's mother, on the night before he died, because he had known what was coming and wanted her to have something of him. That Elizabeth had kept it for 19 years, through everything that followed, the loss of the business, the neighborhood, the financial collapse that came when the district restructured under new management and left people like her without footing. That she had kept it through the clinic, through the diagnosis, through the increasingly narrow calculus of her remaining time. That she was giving it now to her daughter to give to the man responsible, not as accusation, not as leverage. She was explicit about this, underlined, but because she needed him to know that she knew. That someone, at least, had kept the record. That Michael had existed and been loved, and that his erasure had consequences that were still arriving, 19 years later, in the form of a 7-year-old girl eating convenience store food paid for in coins. The letter's final line was 4 words. She has no one. Siak refolded the paper along its original creases, set it down, looked at Martina, who had been watching his face the entire time with that same unreadable precision. Your mother wrote this, he said. Another nod. She sent you to me. Martina shook her head, once clear. He studied her. You came yourself. She reached into her pocket again. She had come prepared, he noted, which meant she had anticipated this conversation, had rehearsed the sequence of what she needed to show him, and produced a second, smaller piece of paper. This one was not a letter. It was a printout, slightly blurred, of a news photograph. He recognized it immediately. A funeral 4 years ago. A mid-level associate of his who had died in a dispute that Siak had not authorized and had consequently resolved with a thoroughness that was discussed quietly in certain circles for some time afterward. He had attended the funeral briefly, at the perimeter, in civilian clothes. He had not intended to be photographed. The shot had been taken from a distance, and his face was partially turned, but it was recognizably him. He was crying in the photograph. Not visibly. Not in any way that the casual viewer would clock, but Martina had not been a casual viewer. She had been, he calculated quickly, approximately 3 years old when this photograph was taken, which meant she had encountered it later, had studied it later, had seen in the partial turn of his face and the particular set of his jaw the thing that only someone looking for it would find. A man in grief, underneath everything, still there. She had chosen him because she had seen him cry at a funeral once, in a photograph, from a distance, at 3 years old or older when she found it. She had looked at the most feared man in Seoul and located, in a single blurred image, the evidence of something survivable in him. He placed the photograph down beside the letter and the locket and looked at the arrangement of objects on the crate between them. The 3 things this child had carried into his world as her entire argument, and felt the machine in his mind go very quiet. The most dangerous thing in Seoul wasn't a bullet. It was a child's memory. He was about to speak when Jihun's voice came through his earpiece, clipped and low, and carrying the specific frequency of a problem that was already in motion. Sir, 2 vehicles, gray, parked on the east side of the building. 4 men, at least. They're moving toward the service entrance. Siak stood. He did it without urgency, which was its own kind of urgency. The controlled movement of a man whose body had already made the relevant calculations before his mind finished the sentence. He looked at Martina, who had gone very still on the crate in the way of a child who has learned that adult stillness means something is wrong. Stay here, he said. Behind the crates. Do not come out until I come back for you. She moved without hesitation. 6 weeks of survival in an unfamiliar building had apparently been excellent preparation for following instructions quickly and without argument. She was behind the crate stack and invisible inside 4 seconds. Siak removed his jacket, folded it over the remaining crate, checked his sidearm, present, chambered, safetied, and walked toward the service entrance. He heard them before the door opened. 3 of them came through the service entrance, 1 held the exterior. Professional spacing. They'd done building entries before. Gray jackets, no visible insignia, the kind of anonymous that is itself a signature to anyone who knows the wardrobe. Choi's men wore gray. This was known. The first one through the door saw Siak standing in the corridor and stopped with the specific frozen quality of a man who was briefed that the building would be empty and is now performing rapid revisions to his entire operational picture. The second man behind him ran into his back. The third spread to the right by instinct, which was the correct tactical response and would have been useful if Siak had been standing still. He wasn't standing still. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not complicated. It was, if anything, the simplest version of Siak that existed, the version that predated the motorcades and the acquisition documents and the espresso at the window. He had not stayed at the top of Seoul's underworld for 2 decades by delegating everything. He had stayed there because the men who dealt with him directly understood, without needing it explained, that the suits and the silence were atmosphere. The instrument underneath was something else entirely. The first man went down. The second redirected his momentum into the wall. The third made a decision. Bae-Siok could see it being made, a clear, visible calculation running across the man's face, and reached for his weapon. Bae-Siok already had his out. The corridor went still. The third man had his weapon half-drawn, frozen at an angle that served neither purpose. Bae-Siok's was level, and his arm was as steady as the rest of him, and the distance between the barrel and the man's center mass was not a distance that rewarded optimism. Outside, through the service door, he could hear the fourth man on his radio. "Drop it," Bae-Siok said. "Then tell your fourth man to step away from the building. Then you're going to tell me who authorized this." A long pause, the kind that contains a person checking whether the situation allows for alternatives and concluding that it doesn't. The weapon went to the floor. Why did the boss pull his own gun for a stranger? Jihun, arriving through the main entrance with 2 members of the inner security detail 30 seconds behind the situation, would ask himself this specific question while watching his employer conduct a calm and thorough interrogation of 3 of Executive Choi's field operatives in a Mapogu warehouse corridor. The answer he arrived at, that Bae-Siok had not pulled his gun for a stranger at all, that the girl was somehow already not a stranger, was more unsettling than the operational implications of what he was witnessing. The operational implications were significant. Choi's men, once it became clear that the calculus of the morning had gone entirely against them, were cooperative in the way that people are cooperative when the alternative has been made concrete. The authorization had come from a mid-level coordinator in Choi's network, not Choi directly, deliberate plausible distance, with instructions to remove the girl from the vicinity of Bae-Siok's operations and deliver her to a location in the Western District where she could be, in the coordinator's phrasing, held as a variable. A variable, a 7-year-old girl in a blue shirt, a variable to be held. Bae-Siok listened to this without visible reaction. He was very good at listening without visible reaction. The machine cataloged it, assigned it appropriate weight, filed it under a category that had not existed yesterday and now occupied significant space. He dismissed Choi's men with instructions that they would find useful to follow. They followed them. He went back to the corridor, where Martina was waiting. She came out from behind the crate stack when she heard his footsteps. She had identified his footsteps, he realized, had already learned the particular sound of them, which meant she had been listening to them for 3 days in the street and cataloging them the way he cataloged patterns. He stood in front of her and looked at the scratch on her cheekbone and the worn cuff of her blue shirt and the steadiness in her eyes that should not have survived the last 6 weeks intact and somehow had. He had a decision to make. He understood this with complete clarity. The decision was not about logistics or security protocols. Those were solvable. Jihun solved things like that before breakfast. The decision was about whether the machine could be switched off, whether the thing Martina had seen in a blurred funeral photograph still existed in sufficient quantity to be useful, whether a man who had spent 20 years removing his capacity for consequence was capable of accepting the weight of one. He crouched to her level. "You're not going back to the crawl space," he said. She looked at him with those wide, still eyes, waiting. "And you're not going anywhere alone until this is finished." He held her gaze. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She nodded, once, the way she did everything, clear, considered, without performance. He stood, looked at Jihun in the doorway, who was already holding his phone with the expression of a man assembling a response protocol in real time. "Is the war starting over a girl?" Jihun had not said this out loud, but Bae-Siok could see the question in the set of his shoulders, in the particular careful neutrality of his face. "Call Executive Choi," Bae-Siok said. "Tell him his coordinator had an unsuccessful morning. Tell him I look forward to discussing it." Jihun's jaw moved slightly. "And if he doesn't take the meeting?" Bae-Siok picked up his jacket from the crate, settled it across his shoulders. The ink on his neck felt tight, the way scar tissue pulls when the weather changes. "He'll take it," he said. "He needs to understand what I'm willing to do now. So do you. Jihun said nothing, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the phone. Behind Seok, Martina picked up the locket from the crate and placed it in her pocket. She did not take the letter. She left it where it was, on the crate, in the corridor, in the building whose deed bore the name of the organization that had unmade her family. She was done presenting her argument. He had heard it. And now Executive Choi was about to discover what happened when GM Seok stopped being theoretical about something. What does Choi say when he finally picks up the phone? And why does the meeting he agrees to, the one he sets for neutral ground, in a restaurant in Jongno in 2 days' time, feel, to everyone in Seok's inner circle, less like a negotiation and more like a countdown? Jihun found temporary accommodation by noon. A secured apartment in Mapogu, 3 blocks from the clinic in Yongdungpo, close enough that the distance to her mother could be measured in minutes rather than the kind of hope that erodes overnight. The building was clean, the unit on an upper floor, the security unobtrusive. A woman from Seok's administrative network, someone who had handled sensitive logistics for a decade without asking questions that weren't her business, was installed in the adjacent unit by 1 in the afternoon. Martina went with her without protest. She took nothing from the crawl space. Seok noted this. She had lived in that space for 6 weeks, and she left it with the same empty hands she'd arrived with, which meant either that she owned nothing worth carrying or that she had already decided she wasn't coming back. He suspected the latter. She struck him as someone who made decisions cleanly, without the backward pull of sentiment. He recognized the trait. He had cultivated it in himself for 20 years. He returned to the crawlspace alone. Jihun had offered to send someone. Seok had declined in the way that foreclosed further discussion. A single look, brief, that Jihun had learned over 14 years of service to interpret correctly. Some things Seok did himself. This was one of them, though he couldn't have explained the precise reason to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. The building was quiet in the early afternoon. The ground floor logistics operation ran morning hours. The upper levels were inert, inventory, equipment, the organized stillness of things waiting to be needed. He took the stairwell to the 3rd floor, walked the corridor to the ventilation panel, and crouched at the entrance of the crawlspace with a flashlight. He had been here before dawn, briefly, in the urgent arithmetic of the morning's events. He had clocked the dimensions, the contents, the photograph. He had not looked carefully. He looked carefully now. The space was 1.5 meters wide, and perhaps 4 meters deep, running parallel to the exterior wall. The concrete was original to the building, poured in the late 90s, rough-surfaced, cold regardless of season. The ventilation duct ran along the ceiling at a height that would have required Seok to lie flat, but allowed a child to sit upright, which she had apparently done for significant portions of time. The duct's lower panel, where it passed directly above the crawl space, had a seam that had been worked loose, not broken, not forced, worked, with the kind of patient, incremental pressure that leaves no damage and requires weeks of small, consistent effort. He put his hand to the seam, applied slight pressure. It flexed open 1 centimeter, enough to see the interior of the duct, and through the duct's opposite grill, the one that opened into the building's main 3rd-floor storage area, a clean sightline to approximately 30 square meters of operational space. How long had she been living in his shadow? 6 weeks in the crawl space, but the duct seam had been worked over time. He ran his thumb along the metal edge where it had been repeatedly flexed. The finish was worn in a pattern consistent with months, not weeks, of contact. Someone had been working this seam patiently, which meant someone had been inside this building, or adjacent to it, for considerably longer than 6 weeks before deciding to move in. He photographed the seam with his phone, sent it to Jihun with no text. Jihun would understand the question and find the answer. He moved the flashlight further into the crawl space. The blanket he had already noted, the water bottle, the book. What he had not examined closely on the first visit, in the urgency of pre-dawn reconnaissance, was the wall. The photograph of Elizabeth had been pinned with a single piece of tape, center wall, at the height a seated child's eye level would place it. He had taken the photograph. The tape remained, a small pale rectangle on the concrete, the ghost of where it had been. Around it, the wall was not empty. He moved the flashlight slowly, left to right, and understood that he was looking at a record. Not a child's drawings, nothing decorative, nothing the way a child personalizes a bedroom. This was documentary, systematic. On the left side, written in pencil so light it was nearly invisible, was a series of dates. The earliest he could identify, holding the flashlight at an angle to catch the graphite, was 14 months ago. The most recent was 4 days before Martina had first appeared behind his motorcade. The dates ran in a vertical column, and beside each one, in a careful abbreviated shorthand that mixed Korean characters with English letters, were notations. He read them. He read all of them. It took 11 minutes, crouched in a concrete space barely large enough to contain him, in the silence of a building that bore his name in documents no one was supposed to find. 11 minutes to read 14 months of a 7-year-old's record of what she had seen and heard through a ventilation grill in a syndicate warehouse. When he was finished, he remained still for a long time. The tattoo on his neck felt hot, like a fresh burn, like ink applied to skin that had not consented to what it would be made to carry. She had not been watching him, not initially. The earliest entries were observational in the dispassionate way of someone cataloging an unfamiliar environment, times when vehicles arrived and departed, descriptions of men she had seen through the grill, the rhythm of the building's activity across different days of the week. A child mapping territory the way animals map territory, not for intelligence but for survival. Understanding what was safe, understanding when to be invisible. But the entries evolved. Around the 4th month, the notations began to change character. Less time and movement, more content. She had been listening as well as watching. The grill opened into the storage area, and the storage area was occasionally used for meetings, not primary meetings. Those happened elsewhere, but secondary ones. The kind of conversations that happened away from the main locations precisely because they were not for general circulation. She had recorded what she heard. In her careful abbreviated shorthand, she had written down names, numbers, references to locations and transactions and arrangements that she could not possibly have fully understood, but had transcribed with the accuracy of someone who understood that the value of information lay not in comprehension, but in preservation. Baemseok read the names. Some of them were his own associates. This was expected. It was his building, his network used it. Some of them were not. Executive Choi's name appeared in the entries beginning 8 months ago. His coordinator's name appeared 6 months ago. The location in the Western District, the one Choi's men had this morning described as where Martina was to be held as a variable, appeared in the entries 3 months ago, in a context that made the Western District location considerably more significant than a holding facility for leverage. Baemseok photographed every entry on the wall, methodically, without haste. What did she see from the vents? Everything. She had seen and heard and recorded everything. For 14 months, in pencil so faint it required a flashlight held at the correct angle to read. A child who had come to a warehouse looking for shelter had accidentally assembled the most comprehensive record of Executive Choi's parallel operation that existed anywhere. She hadn't known that's what it was. She had written down what she heard because she was thorough, because thoroughness was apparently constitutional for her, the same way it was for him. She hadn't understood the significance of what she was recording. He understood it. He backed out of the crawl space and stood in the corridor and called Jihun. "The wall," he said. "Inside the crawl space. I've sent photographs. Get someone who can read the shorthand. It mixes systems. You'll need 2 people. I want it fully transcribed by tonight." Jihun was quiet for precisely the length of time it took to absorb the implications. How extensive? 14 months. Another pause, shorter. Jihun was accelerating his processing in real time, which meant he was also beginning to understand the shape of what this was. "Sir, if what's on that wall is what I think." "It is." "Then the meeting with Choi in 2 days." "Changes," Baemseok said. "Yes." He ended the call and stood in the corridor and looked at the ventilation panel. At the ordinary gray metal of it, the standard fittings, the nothing-to-see-here functionality of a building component that had, for over a year, been a child's window into the interior of a war she hadn't known she was documenting. He thought about what it had cost her to be here. The daily discipline of invisibility, of moving through the building at the right times, of managing water and food, and the fundamental human logistics of survival without leaving evidence of her presence. The cold. The noise from the floors below. The nights. He had slept on worse surfaces in his youth, in worse conditions, and he had been older and harder and not doing it while his mother was in a clinic 3 kilometers away running out of time. She had done all of it. And then, when she had finally decided to act, when she had determined that watching and recording was no longer sufficient, that the situation required something more direct, she had walked out of the crawl space and into the street behind his motorcade with a broken locket in her fist and the specific courage of someone who has already lost enough that fear has become a luxury. He walked the full length of the 3rd-floor corridor before returning to the stairwell. He was not sure what he was looking for. He walked it anyway. Near the far end, beside a fire door that opened onto the external stairwell, he found something Jihun's operative had not flagged in the overnight report. On the floor beside the fire door, partially tucked beneath the door's rubber seal, a piece of paper, folded small, the kind of small that fits in a child's palm. He unfolded it. It was a list, written in the same hand as the wall entries. 12 names, each followed by a single Korean character that functioned, in the context of what he had just read on the wall, as a status marker. He read through the list and stopped at the 9th name. His own. Beside it, the character she had used was not the one she had used for Choi's associates. It was not the one she had used for the coordinator. It was a character that, in its context, meant something closer to undecided, or perhaps, more precisely, waiting. She had come to him undecided. She had stood in the street behind his motorcade with a dead man's locket and a mother's letter and a blurred funeral photograph, and she had been, in her careful, systematic way, still in the process of determining what he was. The morning in the warehouse, the conversation, the objects on the crate, watching him read her mother's words, had apparently resolved the question. She had left the list behind when she left the crawl space. She had taken nothing else, but she had left this. Whether deliberately or in the logistics of a hasty departure, he couldn't establish. It didn't matter. In the city of wolves, a lamb had been keeping score. And the score was more complete than anything his own intelligence network had produced in 8 months of watching Choi. Bayam-seok refolded the list and placed it in the same inside pocket as the photograph of Elizabeth. He buttoned his jacket. He stood at the fire door and looked through its small wired glass window at the external stairwell, at the afternoon light coming in at its low angle, at the city continuing its work beyond the building's walls. The meeting with Choi was in 2 days. The transcription of the wall would be complete by tonight. Jihun would have a full picture by morning, and by morning, Bayam-seok would know precisely how far Choi's parallel operation had extended, which would tell him precisely how many people inside his own organization had been making decisions that served 2 masters, including, possibly, Jihun. He didn't move from the fire door for a long moment. That was the problem with a record this comprehensive. It answered questions you had been asking. It also raised questions you hadn't thought to ask. And once the machine started running those questions, it didn't stop at convenient places. Jihun had been with him for 14 years. Jihun had been first on scene this morning. Jihun had handled the logistics of securing Martina with efficiency and no resistance. Jihun's name was not on the list, which was either because he was clean or because he was careful enough that a 7-year-old listening through a ventilation grill had never heard it spoken in the wrong context. Bayam-seok had built his organization on the ability to distinguish between those 2 possibilities. He had always been good at it. He was going to need to be certain about this one. He took the stairwell down. The building held its silence around him, indifferent and concrete, full of things it had absorbed without understanding. Outside, his car was waiting. And in an apartment 3 blocks from her mother's clinic, a girl who had spent 14 months in his shadow was sitting somewhere in the afternoon light, with nothing in her hands for the first time in weeks. She had delivered everything she came to deliver: the locket, the letter, the list she didn't know she'd left behind. Now it was his move. And Jihun was already calling, the phone buzzing in his pocket, twice. The pattern that meant something has changed, and you need to know now, before Seok reached the ground floor. He answered it on the 3rd buzz. What Jihun said in the next 30 seconds made the question of the meeting with Choi irrelevant, because Choi wasn't waiting 2 days anymore, and the location he'd chosen wasn't the restaurant in Jongno. It was the clinic in Yeongyungpo. Before we go any further, pause here for a second, because this story just showed you something real. What Martina did in that crawl space, the dates, the names, the shorthand notations, that is called open-source intelligence gathering. It is a skill used by investigative journalists, human rights documentarians, and legal advocates the world over. The principle is simple. You do not need access to power to document it. You need consistency, patience, and the discipline to record what you witness accurately, even when you don't yet understand its full significance. Martina didn't know she was building a case. She was surviving, but survival with a pencil becomes testimony, and testimony in the right hands becomes consequence. If this moved you, if you believe that the people least expected to hold the powerful accountable are sometimes the ones who do it best, hit that like button now and subscribe so you're here when the testimony reaches the right hands. And drop a comment. What's one thing you've witnessed that you wish someone had written down? You'd be surprised how many people are waiting to read exactly that. The clinic in Yeongyungpo was not on any official registry. It operated out of a converted ground floor unit in a residential building on a street that smelled of fish markets and diesel, the kind of street that exists in every major city as proof that the official version of the city is not the whole version. The sign above the door was small and handwritten. The waiting area inside held 6 plastic chairs, 4 of them occupied when Seok's unmarked car stopped across the street, and the woman at the front desk was doing 3 things simultaneously with the focused efficiency of someone who had long ago accepted that resources would never match the need. Jihun had called ahead, not as himself, through a contact, framed as a family inquiry, no names that connected to anything. The woman at the desk had confirmed that the patient was stable for the moment and receiving a visitor was possible if brief. Seok sat in the parked car for 90 seconds before getting out. This was not hesitation. He told himself it was not hesitation. He was reviewing the operational parameters of the visit, what he would say, what he would not say, how to extract useful information about her condition and current care without revealing the nature of his interest. Clean, purposeful, in and out. He got out of the car. The woman at the front desk looked up when he entered. He was wearing a coat over his suit, collar up, nothing about him that announced itself, but there was a quality to Seok's presence that clothing adjustments did not fully resolve, and the woman's eyes moved to him with the particular alertness of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation in real time. She checked whatever Jihun's contact had arranged on her intake sheet, nodded once, and pointed him toward the corridor without speaking. Room 4 was at the end. He walked the corridor at his normal pace. The building smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath the antiseptic was specifically deployed to address the smell of bodies working very hard to continue. He had been in buildings like this before, in contexts that had nothing to do with medicine. The smell was the same regardless of context. It was the smell of time running in one direction. He stopped outside room 4, put his hand on the door, pushed it open. Elizabeth Benjamin was awake. She was sitting partially upright against 2 thin pillows, a blanket across her lap, her hands folded on top of it with the careful arrangement of someone who has learned to make deliberate choices about how they present themselves when their body is no longer cooperating with their preferences. She was wearing a pale blue hospital gown, and her hair was combed, recently, he thought, which meant she had been told someone was coming and had prepared for it with whatever she had available. She was 41 years old. She looked both older and younger than that simultaneously, older in the hollows of her face, the specific translucence of her skin, the way her collarbones stood in relief beneath the gown's neckline, younger in her eyes, which were dark and very clear and currently engaged in the same process the front desk woman had performed, except with considerably more information to work with. She was looking at him the way people look at something they have spent a long time imagining and are now measuring against the reality. Siak closed the door behind him, pulled the single chair in the room away from the wall, and sat without being invited, because waiting to be invited would have been a performance neither of them had agreed to perform. He said nothing for a moment, neither did she. Will she recognize him as the monster? He was about to construct the opening of his prepared remarks, the clinical, purposeful version of this visit, when she spoke first. "You look exactly like your photographs," she said. Her voice was even, measured in the way of someone who had decided in advance the precise register they intended to maintain. "There are more of them than you'd think, if you know where to look." Siak held her gaze. "You know who I am." "I've known who you were for 19 years. She said it without heat, without the tremor that anger produces when it's being restrained. She said it the way you state the coordinates of a place you have been navigating toward for a very long time. "I knew when the district restructured. I knew when my brother's operation stopped existing and something with a different name appeared in its place. I know what clean paperwork looks like from the outside when what it's covering isn't clean." He didn't confirm or deny. This was habitual. She read the habit accurately. "I'm not here to record anything," she said. "I'm not wearing anything. I have approximately—" She paused, and the pause contained a calculation he recognized as the kind people make when they are rationing a finite resource, not enough time left to spend it on anything that isn't the point. Her eyes moved to the door, then back to him. "Is she all right?" "Yes." "Where is she?" "Secured accommodation in Mapogu, 3 blocks from here. She's safe." Something moved through Elizabeth's face, not relief exactly, something that relief becomes after it has been deferred long enough that the body no longer knows how to process it at full volume. It arrived quietly and settled. "She found you," she said, not a question, not surprise. She was persistent. A very faint shift at the corner of her mouth. "She gets that from my brother." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived at the same location from opposite directions and are taking a moment to establish that they are, in fact, in the same place. Siak spoke first this time. "Tell me about your care." She looked at him steadily. "You want to know what it costs?" "I want to know what it costs and what it isn't covering, and what the actual prognosis is from someone who has been reading the charts rather than being managed through them." Elizabeth regarded him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, not suspicion, not gratitude, something more complicated than either. Then she told him, clearly, without softening or dramatizing. She spoke about her condition the way she had spoken about everything else, with the precision of someone who had decided that clarity was the only remaining form of dignity available to her. He listened completely. The machine cataloged treatment gaps, resource deficiencies, the specific ways that a clinic operating on charitable margins differed from a facility with actual capacity. He asked 2 questions, both specific, both about treatment options she had been told were unavailable. She answered both with the same clarity. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Can a man pay for a soul with blood money?" The question had no clean answer, and he knew it. The money existed. The capability to redirect it existed. The infrastructure to arrange better care, a proper facility, specialists who did not operate out of converted ground floor units on streets that smelled of fish markets. All of it existed, and all of it was accessible to him within a phone call's radius. The question was not capability. The question was what it meant to deploy capability in this direction, toward this woman, whose brother's absence was the foundation on which his capability had been built. He did not resolve the question. He set it aside the way you set aside something that will require returning to, and addressed what was immediate. I'm going to make arrangements, he said. Better facility, proper specialist care. It will happen quickly and it will not require anything from you except agreement. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. And what does it require from you? She asked. He held her gaze. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. That isn't an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at the window. The afternoon light came through it at an angle that caught the edge of her profile and held it briefly in something that resembled its former self. The woman in the photograph, the one smiling for the child behind the camera, the one who had combed her hair this morning because someone was coming and she had decided to meet them on her own terms. Michael used to say, she said, still looking at the window, that there were two kinds of dangerous men, the ones who don't know what they're doing and the ones who do. She turned back to him. He said the second kind were the only ones worth being afraid of because at least they were making a choice. Seok said nothing. He wasn't afraid of you at the end, she said. I want you to know that. I don't know why I want you to know that, but I do. The machine had no category for this. He let it sit unprocessed. Accept the arrangements, he said quietly. For her, whatever you think of where the resources come from. Elizabeth's hands rearranged themselves on the blanket, a small, almost involuntary movement, the kind the body makes when the mind arrives at a decision. She chose you, she said. She looked at 14 months of evidence and she chose you. My daughter has very good judgment. A pause. I'm going to trust it one more time. He stood to leave, had the door handle in his hand. Jihun Seok. He stopped, turned. Elizabeth was looking at him with her clear, steady eyes. She had the expression of someone about to do something that costs them something real. She talks in her sleep, she said. She calls out she has since she was 3. A breath. She's going to need someone who stays in the building, someone who answers when she calls, not a guard, not a coordinator. Her chin lifted, and there it was, the gesture, the same precise degree of lift he had seen on the street, the constitutional thoroughness, the I have decided and I am here. She got that from me. Seok looked at the woman who had survived 19 years of consequence with her clarity intact, and her daughter's judgment sound, and her brother's locket passed forward like a torch rather than a weapon. He nodded once, then he left. He didn't know what a soul cost, but he was beginning to understand what it cost to be without one. The car was where he'd left it. Jihun was outside it, leaning against the hood with his phone in his hand, and an expression that Seok had learned, over 14 years, to read correctly. It was the expression Jihun wore when something had happened that could not be undone, and Seok needed to know about it before he took another step. Talk, Seok said. Jihun looked at his phone, then at Seok. The facility in Yeongdeungpo that you're planning to move her to. A pause with weight in it. Choi's network has a financial interest in it. Minority, buried 3 layers deep but present. He put the phone away. If we move her there, Choi knows within 24 hours. Her location, her condition, her value as leverage, all of it. Seok stood on the pavement outside the clinic on the street that smelled of fish markets and diesel, and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. He had just told a dying woman that arrangements would be made quickly. He had just accepted her trust, which had been extended at considerable personal cost, and was not the kind of thing that survived being mishandled. Every facility he could reach quickly was reachable because his network touched it. And his network, as of this morning, had a contamination problem with an unclear perimeter. The most dangerous thing in Seoul wasn't a bullet. It was a man who had just made a promise and discovered the ground beneath it was not solid. He looked back at the clinic door, at the small handwritten sign, at the 6 plastic chairs and the overwhelmed desk and the corridor that smelled of time running in one direction. Then he looked at Jihun. Find me something Choi has never touched, he said. Private, off any network I've used in the last 3 years. He buttoned his coat. And find it tonight, because I told her it would happen quickly. Jihun nodded, started to turn toward the car. Jihun. He stopped. Seok held his gaze for exactly long enough to make the next words land at their proper weight. If the facility you find has a single connection to anything I haven't personally verified, I'll know. And I'll know it was you who missed it. Jihun met his eyes, didn't look away. Understood, sir. He got in the car. Bayam remained on the pavement one moment longer, looking at nothing, carrying the weight of a nod from a woman who had every reason to withhold it. Inside room 4, Elizabeth was looking at the window again. He didn't know this, but he knew she was doing something with the time she had left, and whatever it was deliberate, and it was hers. He owed her that much. He owed her considerably more than that. Because Jihun was about to make a decision of his own, and unlike Elizabeth's, it would not be extended in trust. Jihun made the call at 2:17 in the morning. Bayam knew this later, the exact time, the duration, the cell tower the signal bounced through, the number it connected to, which was not registered to anyone but whose pattern of use over the preceding 8 months told a story that was by then no longer surprising. He knew all of it later. Assembled from pieces by people he trusted more than he had trusted Jihun, which was its own kind of indictment, that the trust had been so total it had made him lazy about verifying it. 20 years at the top of the Seoul underworld, and he had been lazy about Jihun. He filed this under the category of things he would not repeat. The category was getting crowded. The day before the call had been operational. Clean on the surface, the way days are clean when the contamination is underneath. Jihun had delivered on the facility search, a private medical unit attached to a rehabilitation center in Yunpyonggu, genuinely disconnected from any network Bayam had touched in the past 4 years, funded through a university hospital endowment that Choi's reach had not extended to. Bayam had verified it himself through 2 independent channels before authorizing anything. The transfer arrangements for Elizabeth were set for the following morning. The clinic in Yongdyungpo had been notified through the same indirect contact Jihun had used initially. Martina had been told. She had received this information in the way she received most information, without visible reaction, processing it somewhere interior and returning a single nod when the processing was complete. But that evening, through the woman managing the adjacent unit, Bayam received a report that Martina had eaten a full meal for the first time since the woman had been installed. All of it, without being encouraged. He read this report at his desk and did not examine what he felt about it. He had given Jihun 3 tasks for the following day. The facility coordination, a meeting preparation brief for the rescheduled conversation with Choi, now moved to a location of Bayam choosing rather than Choi's, which was itself a message. And the continued transcription of Martina's wall notations, which 2 analysts had been working through since the previous afternoon, and which was producing, with each passing hour, a more complete picture of exactly how extensively Choi had been constructing something parallel to Bayam organization within its own structure. Jihun had confirmed all 3 tasks. Calm, precise, 14 years of calibrated reliability. At 2:17 in the morning, he made the call. Bayam was not asleep when his secondary phone registered the alert. He had installed secondary monitoring on his own operations communication infrastructure 3 days ago, not targeted at Jihun specifically, targeted at the perimeter, the outer ring of contacts and channels that Choi's people would need to use if they were maintaining communication with someone inside. He had not told Jihun about the monitoring. He had not told anyone. The alert was not from the outer ring. It was from a number 2 layers inside his own network, close enough that whoever was using it had access that required significant trust to obtain. The alert flagged the call's origin tower, cross-referenced it against the known locations of his inner circle at that hour, and produced a result that the machine in his mind accepted with a quietness that was worse than any reaction he might have had. 2:17. Jihun's apartment building's nearest tower, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, a number that resolved, through the secondary monitorings cross-referencing, to a burner registered 8 months ago, the same month Choi's name had first appeared in Martina's wall notations. 8 months. Jihun had been running both directions for 8 months. Is loyalty dead? Bae sat at his desk in the dark with the secondary phone in his hand and the city below him doing what the city always did regardless of what happened in the rooms above it. He sat for a long time, not 11 minutes this time, longer. He was not processing grief. He had removed grief from his operational toolkit at 31. In a specific circumstance he did not revisit. What he was processing was the structural problem, the load-bearing wall that had just revealed itself to be hollow, and everything that had been resting against it that now needed immediate redistribution. Jihun had coordinated the facility search. Jihun had made the indirect contact with the Yongdumpo clinic. Jihun knew Elizabeth's transfer time. Jihun knew the Yumpyeonggu location. Jihun knew where Martina was sleeping. Bae was moving before the thought completed itself. Jacket, keys, secondary phone. The elevator was too slow. He took the stairs. He drove himself. This was unusual enough that if anyone had been watching the building's exit feed, they would have flagged it immediately, which was precisely why he exited through the service level rather than the main garage. 14 years of Jihun knowing his protocols meant 14 years of Jihun knowing which exits to watch. He used the one that predated Jihun's tenure. The drive to Mapogu took 19 minutes at that hour. He called the woman managing the adjacent unit from the car. 2 rings, 3, 4, the length of time it takes a person to wake from deep sleep and locate a phone that was supposed to be beside them. On the 5th ring she answered, voice thick, immediately sharpening when she heard who was calling. "Is she in the unit?" he said. A pause, the sound of movement, a door, the specific acoustic of a person checking a space that should contain something and verifying that it does. "Yes," the woman said. "She's asleep. I can see her from the doorway." "Don't open the door. Don't turn any lights on. Write down what I'm about to tell you." He told her. She wrote it down. He ended the call and drove. He was in the building's stairwell when he heard the exterior door on the ground floor open below him. He stopped on the landing, controlled his breathing to nothing, listened. 2 sets of footsteps. Unhurried, they believed they had the timing advantage, believed they were operating on information that was current. They were operating on information that was 8 hours old and had been fed to them by a man who didn't know that the thing he'd fed them was already being reconstructed around its absence. They took the elevator. Bae took the stairs. He reached the corridor outside Martina's unit 4 seconds before the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hall. The woman from the adjacent unit was already in the doorway. He had told her to have Martina ready to move, shoes on, no questions, and Martina was behind her in the dim light of the unit's interior, shoes on, a small bag that the woman had apparently prepared for this kind of contingency over the preceding days. Bae had not instructed the bag. The woman had done it on her own judgment. He made a note to compensate her accordingly. He moved them both into the adjacent unit, closed the door, positioned himself to the left of it where the angle from the corridor's entry point created a blind spot. The unit was dark. He did not draw his weapon. Not yet. The footsteps in the corridor stopped outside Martina's door. A knock, quiet, controlled, not a raid then, an extraction. They wanted her ambulatory, which told him Choi's instructions were to deliver her functional. Leverage needed to be visible to be effective. This was useful information. Silence from inside the unit, as expected. A second knock, then a pause with a different quality, the pause of people recalibrating. Then a sound he recognized as a card reader being applied to an electronic lock, which told him Jihun had provided access credentials along with the location. The door to the empty unit opened. He heard them go in, heard the specific silence of people encountering an empty room when they expected an occupied one. A brief exchange in low voices, one word from each, clipped, the compressed communication of professionals arriving at a shared conclusion. Then the door to the adjacent unit opened. He was already there. What followed was brief and was not complicated. 2 men, professional, operating on the assumption that the target was a sleeping child and the only obstacle was a civilian woman. The assumption was incorrect on the second point in a way that the first man registered immediately, and the second man registered via the first man's trajectory into the corridor wall. Neither of them required hospitalization. Bae-Seok was precise about this in the way he was precise about things that needed to send a message without closing a conversation. They needed to be functional enough to deliver what they had experienced back to the person who sent them. He crouched in the corridor beside the first man and spoke quietly. "Tell Choi that the next people he sends will not be walking back," he said. "Tell him I know how long. Tell him I know the number and the tower and the 8 months." He held the man's gaze until he was certain the message had been received at the correct depth. "Tell him Jihun is no longer a resource he can use, tonight or any other night." He stood, looked at Martina, who was standing in the doorway of the adjacent unit with her shoes on and her small bag, and her expression, that specific, unreadable steadiness, the wide, dark eyes that held the room without flinching. She had heard everything. He hadn't shielded her from it. There hadn't been time, and he suspected that shielding her from things was not what she needed from him. She had been unshielded for 14 months in a crawl space with a ventilation grill. She knew what the world contained. "Are you hurt?" he said. She shook her head. "Good." He looked at the woman. "Take her down the service stairs. The car is in the service level. Wait inside it. Don't open the doors for anyone except me." The woman nodded. She was pale but steady, another person, he noted, who was more capable under pressure than their ordinary context suggested. There seemed to be several of these around Martina, which perhaps said something about the kind of gravity she generated in people. He watched them go down the corridor, watched until the stairwell door closed behind them. Then he turned and looked at the city through the corridor window. Seoul at 3 in the morning, indifferent and lit, running its own logistics without reference to what happened in its buildings. Who can Bae-Seok trust now? He ran the inventory. Clean contacts, independently verified, no Jihun involvement in their cultivation. 3 names, possibly 4, pending a review he would conduct before dawn. His secondary monitoring infrastructure, which Jihun had not known about. The woman currently descending the service stairs with Martina. 2 analysts working a transcription in a secure location Jihun had never been given. And a 7-year-old girl who had spent 14 months recording the truth in pencil on a concrete wall, and had then walked out into traffic to hand it to the one person who could use it. Is Martina the only one truly on his side? Not the only one, but the one who had chosen it most deliberately, with the most complete information, against the most reasonable set of reasons to choose otherwise. He took the stairs down. Jihun's phone rang at 3:41. Bae-Seok called it himself, from the secondary phone, sitting in the service level of the Mapogu building with the engine running and Martina asleep in the back seat, in a way that suggested her body had simply decided that the emergency was over and acted accordingly. Jihun answered on the second ring. Alert, he had been awake, waiting. "Sir," steady, 14 years of practice steadiness, "is everything." "The number you called at 2:17, Bae-Seok said. "I have the tower, I have the duration, I have 8 months of pattern." He kept his voice level. This was not difficult. The machine did not do this kind of work with volume. "You have until I finish this sentence to tell me something that changes what I do next." Silence. Not the silence of someone constructing a denial. The silence of someone who has been living inside a particular decision for 8 months and has just arrived at the place where the decision ends and its consequences begin. "I thought she was going to get you killed," Jihun said finally. His voice had changed. The professional steadiness was still there, but something beneath it had surfaced, something that sounded, improbably, like exhaustion. "A child, in the middle of everything with Choi escalating. I thought you were making a decision based on something that wasn't. I thought I was protecting the organization." "You thought I was weak," Bae-Seok said. A pause, honest at least in its length. "Yes," Jihun said. Bae-Seok looked at the back seat. At Martina, asleep, her small bag on her lap, one hand open on the seat beside her the way hands go when the body finally releases its grip on the day. She wasn't asking for his money. She was asking for his soul. And the man who had stood closest to him for 14 years had looked at that and seen only liability. "Come in," Bayam said. "The Siacho office. 6 in the morning. Come alone and come clean or don't come at all." He ended the call. In the back seat, Martina exhaled slowly in her sleep. The deep, unconscious release of someone whose body knows, even before the mind catches up, that the immediate danger has passed. Bayam pulled out of the service level and onto the empty street. He had 3 hours until 6. He had 3 names on a verified contact list and a transcription that was 17 pages long and growing. He had a transfer to complete for a woman in a Yeongdeungpo clinic who had given him her trust at considerable personal cost. And he had, in the back seat, the only person in Seoul who had looked at the full accounting of who he was and decided, with complete information, to place a broken locket in his hand anyway. The ink on his neck felt tight in the cold air of the car, a warning he had always ignored. He was listening to it now. Whether Jihun came at 6 would tell him one thing. What Jihun said when he arrived would tell him everything else. And what was in the 17 pages of transcription, the part the analysts had flagged an hour ago as requiring his personal attention before any other decision was made, was going to make the question of Jihun feel, by morning, like the smallest problem in the room. Jihun came at 6. He came alone, as instructed, and he came with a folder, not a tablet, not a phone, a physical folder, which was either a gesture of sincerity or a very sophisticated performance of one. He set it on the table in the Siacho office without being asked and sat down across from Bayam and looked at him with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the night arriving at the place where a decision ends. The folder contained 8 months of documentation, every contact with Choi's network, every piece of information passed, every location, every schedule, every operational detail Jihun had provided in the belief that he was managing a situation his employer was too compromised to manage himself. Bayam read it without comment. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at Jihun for a long moment. "The transfer," he said. "Elizabeth, the Yunpyeonggu facility, did you give Choi that location?" Jihun held his gaze. "No." "Why not?" A pause that contained something genuine and uncomfortable. "Because she's dying," he said. "And I didn't," he stopped, restarted. "I passed operational information. I didn't pass her." Bayam considered this for the length of time it deserved. "The distinction matters to you." "Yes." "Then you understand why it matters to me." He stood, picked up his secondary phone. "You're confined to the Siacho building until I determine the extent of what Choi now knows and what he's moved on. You don't make calls. You don't send messages. You sit here and you wait." Jihun nodded. He looked, for the first time in 14 years, small in his chair. Bayam was at the door when Jihun spoke. "Sir, the flagged section of the transcription, did you read it?" "Not yet." "Read it before you do anything else today." A pause waited with the specific gravity of someone who has spent the night knowing something terrible and is only now permitted to say it. "Choi isn't waiting for a meeting. He's already inside." The flagged section was 17 pages in. Martina's notation was dated 11 days ago. The shorthand was compressed. She had been writing quickly, or in poor light, or both. The 2 analysts had worked it for 6 hours, and the transcription still had gaps, marked in brackets, where the abbreviated system she developed resisted decoding. But the architecture of what remained was clear enough. Choi had acquired a controlling interest in the Yunpyeonggu Rehabilitation Center's parent organization 4 months ago. Not a minority interest buried in layers. A controlling interest, held through a structure so clean that Bayam independent verification 2 days ago had not reached it. The 2 channels he had used to verify the facility had both, according to Martina's wall, been penetrated by Choi's network in the preceding quarter. The facility he had told Elizabeth was safe was Choi's. The transfer was scheduled for 9 in the morning. It was 7:43. The tattoo on his neck felt hot, like something applied under duress. in a moment he hadn't understood the full cost of. He moved without the motorcade. Single car, 2 men from the verified 3-name list, no communication on any channel Jihun had ever had access to. Martina was in the back seat again. He had not left her at the Mapogu apartment because the Mapogu apartment's location was in Jihun's folder, which meant it was potentially in Choi's knowledge, which meant it was not an apartment anymore but a liability. She sat with her small bag on her lap, fully awake, watching the city move past the window with the focused attention of someone tracking route. He called the Yongdumpo clinic from the car. The direct line, not the indirect contact. The woman at the front desk answered. "The patient in room 4, he said. "I need to speak with whoever is responsible for her care this morning." A pause, the specific quality of a pause that contains information being assembled on the other end. "Sir, there are men here. They arrived 20 minutes ago. They said they were from the transfer facility, that they were here to prepare the patient for." "How many?" "4, I counted 4. They have documentation, it looks." "Lock room 4 from the outside. Do not let anyone enter. Tell the patient nothing. Do it now and stay on the line." He heard her moving. The background sounds of a clinic morning, chairs, voices, the desk phone hitting its surface as she set it down without disconnecting. A corridor, a door, the specific sound of a lock engaging. Then her voice again, lower. "It's done. But sir, they're going to notice. They're in the waiting area and they can see the corridor and they're already." "What floor is the waiting area?" "Ground. Room 4 is ground, rear corridor." "Does the rear corridor have an exterior exit?" "A fire door. It opens onto the service alley behind the building." He looked at the navigation. 11 minutes at current traffic. "Keep the line open. Tell me the moment anything changes." He ended the navigation and recalculated the route. Will the boss burn his own city to save one room? The question assumed the city and the room were separate considerations. They had stopped being separate at some point in the last 6 days. He couldn't locate the precise moment, which was itself information about what the last 6 days had done to his operational architecture. The room was in the city. The woman in the room was connected to the girl in the back seat. The girl in the back seat was connected to 19 years of arithmetic that had finally presented its invoice. Everything was the same calculation now. He had built the city. He could navigate its service alleys. He left the 2 men with the car on the street parallel to the alley and went through the fire door himself. The rear corridor of the clinic was narrow, poorly lit, smelling of the same antiseptic and underneath antiseptic as every corridor in every building like this. Room 4 was the second door on the left. He could hear, from the far end of the corridor where it opened into the main waiting area, the sounds of a situation developing, a voice, male, carrying the clipped authority of someone accustomed to compliance, asking a question for the 2nd or 3rd time. He knocked twice on room 4, the pattern he had used on his one previous visit, specific enough to mean something to a woman who paid close attention to details. A pause, then the lock from inside. The woman at the front desk had not locked it from the outside. She had relayed his instruction to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had locked it from the inside herself, which was a distinction that mattered in ways he didn't have time to fully process. He opened the door. Elizabeth was sitting up in the bed with the same deliberate arrangement he had seen before, hands folded, back straight, making her choices about how she presented herself with whatever she had available. She looked at him, and then at the doorway behind him, and her eyes moved quickly through a calculation. "Martina," she said. "In the car, safe." He crossed to the window and assessed the alley. "Clear. We're leaving through the fire door. Can you walk?" She looked at him steadily. "I can walk." "It will be quick." "I understand, quick." She was already moving the blanket aside. "Help me with the IV line." He helped her with the IV line. This was not something he had done before. He managed it without damaging anything, which he considered acceptable under the circumstances. She swung her legs to the floor and stood with the careful, concentrated effort of someone requiring a moment to establish that the floor and their body are in agreement. Then she nodded. They went. The voice from the waiting area reached them at the fire door, louder now, the question having escalated from authority to demand. A second voice responding, the front desk woman, buying time with the specific skill of someone who had decided to be unhelpful in a way that was difficult to prove. The fire door opened into the alley. The morning air arrived cold and immediate. Elizabeth moved through it with her hospital gown and her bare feet on the concrete, and her jaw set at the angle her daughter had inherited, and Bayam Siak stayed at her left, where the IV line's remaining length required someone to manage it. At the end of the alley, the car, one of his two men at the rear door, already open. Elizabeth stopped when she saw it. Not hesitation, she was looking at the back seat. At Martina, who had seen them through the window and whose expression had undergone the only transformation Bayam Siak had witnessed in it that was entirely uncalculated and uncontrolled. The complete, unguarded collapse of a child who has been holding something together for a very long time and has just seen the thing they were holding it together for. Elizabeth made a sound he didn't have language for. She covered the remaining distance to the car with a speed that her body shouldn't have had available. He looked away, gave them the alley. Behind him, through the clinic's fire door, he heard the waiting area voice reach its final register, the one that precedes action rather than requests it, then footsteps in the rear corridor. He turned back to the car. "Go," he said to his man. "The secondary location, you have the address." "And you, sir?" "I'll follow." The car pulled out of the alley. He watched it go, watched the back window where two heads were now visible, one larger, one small, the small one leaning against the larger, and then turned to face the fire door as it opened from the inside. Two men, gray jackets, the specific expression of people who have arrived at the conclusion that the situation has moved past its briefing parameters and are operating on improvisation. Bayam Siak stood in the service alley of a clinic on a street that smelled of fish markets and diesel and looked at Choi's men and felt the machine settle into the particular clarity it reached when all the variables had resolved into a single, simple problem. "Tell me where Choi is," he said, "or explain to him why you couldn't. What is Martina's life worth to the syndicate?" Choi had his answer prepared. It was the same answer the syndicate had always given when confronted with things that complicated the arithmetic, a number, a variable, a calculation of leverage versus cost. The girl was worth exactly what she could extract from Bayam Siak's decision-making. No more. Leverage had a market rate, and Choi had priced it accordingly. What Choi had not priced was the possibility that Bayam Siak had already stopped making decisions on the syndicate's arithmetic. He had stopped somewhere in a clinic corridor, or in a crawl space with a flashlight, or on a pavement outside a Yongdungpo building, reading 4 words at the bottom of a dying woman's letter. She has no one. Had, past tense, as of this morning, as of a car pulling out of a service alley with 2 heads visible in the back window. Choi's men gave him a location. He had not done anything that required hospitalization to obtain it. He had simply stood in the alley and looked at them in the particular way that communicated, without requiring elaboration, the cost-benefit analysis of non-cooperation. The location was not a neutral restaurant in Jongno. It was Bayam Siak's own headquarters building in Seoul, the one whose deed was in his name, the one where Jihun was currently sitting in a room, confined, waiting. Choi had been in the building for 2 hours. He had walked in through the front entrance with 4 men and the credentials of someone who had, over 8 months of careful preparation, made himself structurally indistinguishable from a person with the right to be there. The building's security had processed him the way a system processes something it has been slowly taught to accept. Bayam Siak stood in the alley and absorbed this. His headquarters, his name on the deed, his throne of glass, as he had once thought of it, before a girl in a blue shirt had stood on the street outside and stared at it with the knowledge of someone who knew exactly what glass was made of. He didn't know what it cost to burn an empire. He was about to find out if he was willing to pay it. He called his verified contact, the first name on the 3-name list, and gave 3 instructions, each precise, each assuming that what came next would not be clean or quiet or containable within the Siacho building's walls. Then he straightened his jacket. The ink on his neck traced its thorns downward in the cold morning air. He had built the city. He knew every entrance to every building in it, including the one Choi was currently sitting in, waiting for Bayam Siak to come to terms. Choi was about to discover that terms were no longer the format. The final confrontation was coming. Not in 2 days, not at a neutral table, not in any of the managed, distanced, structured ways that Bayam Siak had conducted every significant confrontation of the last 20 years. It was coming tonight, in the rain, in a building whose name was on his documents, and whose weight he had been carrying since before he understood what weight meant. And the choice he would have to make inside it, the one that would determine what remained of Bayam Siak when the building's lights came back on, was the one he had been moving toward since a 7-year-old girl opened her fist on a sunlit pavement and showed him what 19 years of clean arithmetic actually looked like. The secondary location was a house. Not an apartment, not a secured unit in a managed building. A house, detached, in a residential pocket of Yunpyeonggu where the streets were narrow, and the buildings were low, and the city's density thinned enough that you could hear individual things rather than the accumulated roar of everything at once. It belonged to a woman on Bayam Siak's verified contact list, a former logistics coordinator who had left his network 3 years ago on clean terms, settled into a life that had no visible connection to anything he currently operated, and had agreed without hesitation when he called at 7 in the morning and asked for the use of her space. She had left a key under a specific stone and gone to stay with her sister. No questions. This was the quality of person Bayam Siak had learned, over 20 years, to identify and maintain at careful distance. People whose reliability was not contingent on proximity to power. They were rare. He had 3 of them. He was beginning to understand that 3 was not enough, and had always not been enough, and that the reason he hadn't noticed was that he had been substituting proximity for reliability and calling the result loyalty. The house had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with windows that looked onto a small walled garden. His man had arrived with Elizabeth and Martina 40 minutes before Bayam Siak got there. When he walked through the door, Elizabeth was on the sitting room couch under 2 blankets his man had sourced from somewhere in the house, her IV line managed with improvised but functional rigging, her eyes closed. Not asleep, he could tell from the quality of her stillness that she was resting with full awareness, the way people rest when they cannot afford to be fully absent from their own situation. Martina was on the floor beside the couch. Not a chair, the floor, cross-legged, close enough to the couch that her shoulder was touching the blanket's edge. She had a book open on her knee, the coverless one from the crawl space. She had gone back for it at some point without anyone noticing. She looked up when he entered. He looked at her. He looked at Elizabeth. He looked at the small garden through the window, at the light moving through it in the late morning the way light moves through contained spaces, bounded, specific, paying attention to what it illuminates. He sat in the chair across the room. His man was in the kitchen. The house was quiet in the particular way of a place that has just received people who needed exactly this. He had calls to make. He knew this. The Siacho building, Choi's presence in it, the confrontation that was now a matter of timing rather than decision, all of it was assembling itself in the background of the machine and required his engagement within the hour. He was aware of this the way you are aware of weather when you are currently inside. He sat in the chair and did not make the calls yet. Martina closed the book, set it beside her. She looked at him with the expression he had been reading for 6 days now and had still not fully decoded, that wide, steady, underneath it something enormous look that had survived everything her 7 years had required it to survive. "You have a question," he said. She shook her head. He waited. "I have an answer," she said. "You have a question." He looked at her. In the sitting room's quiet, with her mother's breathing a steady presence on the couch beside her, Martina Benjamin met his eyes and held them with the patience of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has identified this as it. He had been asking since Apgujeongro. since the locket, since the 3 days of motorcade and blue shirt and small sneakers on sunlit pavement. The question had been the constant underneath all the operational ones, the one the machine could not file because it had no category for it. Why him? He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without softening. Why did you choose me? She didn't answer immediately. This was not hesitation. He had learned to distinguish her processing from hesitation. They were entirely different in quality. Hesitation was reluctance in motion. What she did was something else. She gathered, the way you gather before saying something that has weight and needs to be set down carefully or it damages the floor. I found the photograph, she said. The funeral one. It was in my mother's things, in a box she kept under her bed. Her voice was even, unhurried, carrying the bilingual rhythm he had first seen in Elizabeth's letter, Korean and English moving through each other like two currents in the same water. She didn't know I found it. I was looking for pictures of my uncle because I'd never seen his face. She had pictures of him in the box, and the funeral photograph was with them. He said nothing. You were at the edge of the picture. I almost didn't see you. She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. But I saw you, and I looked at you for a long time because you were the only one at the funeral who wasn't looking at the coffin. You were looking at the ground, and your face, she paused, gathered again. My mother makes the same face when she thinks I'm not watching, when something hurts and she doesn't want me to know. The sitting room held the silence. Can a child see what a city misses? 20 years. 20 years of the face he maintained in every room, at every table, in every negotiation and confrontation and cold corridor. The face that was a closed door with no handle on the outside. And in a blurred photograph from a funeral 4 years ago, taken from a distance by a photographer who hadn't known what they were capturing, a child who had learned to read her mother's grief, had looked at the edge of the frame and found the seam. I didn't know who you were then, Martina continued. I was 3 when she kept the picture. I found it when I was 6. I asked my mother who the man in the dark coat was. A pause. She told me your name. He was still. I looked you up, she said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a 7-year-old who had apparently been conducting research with the same thoroughness she applied to everything else. I found what you were, what you did, what your name meant. She looked at him without flinching. I wasn't going to come. For a long time I wasn't going to come. What changed? She looked at her mother. At the blanket's edge where her shoulder was touching it. When she looked back, something in her expression had shifted, not the steadiness, that remained, but something underneath it had risen closer to the surface. She stopped being able to get up, Martina said. 4 months ago, she could get up before that. She was going to the clinic herself. She was doing things. A breath, controlled. She was very good at controlled. When she stopped getting up, I looked at the photograph again. I looked at your face again. She folded her hands on her knee with the gesture he recognized as her mother's. A man who cries at a funeral isn't a man who has nothing left. He still has something. Whatever he's been doing with it. Her chin came up a precise degree. He still has it. He didn't know what a soul cost. He had recently begun to suspect he'd been paying for it all along and simply hadn't been reading the receipts. Bayam Siak sat in the chair across the room and looked at the girl on the floor and understood, with the complete and undeflectable clarity of something that has been approaching for a long time and has finally arrived at its destination, what she had done. She had not come to him in spite of what he was. She had come because of what he was, because the thing she needed was specifically located in the gap between who he appeared to be and who she had seen in the photograph. She had needed someone dark enough that his protection meant something, and human enough that his protection was possible. She had conducted 14 months of research. She had assembled her evidence. She had walked out of a crawl space in his building and into the street behind his motorcade, because she had done the calculation and arrived at him as the answer. He had spent 6 days thinking of himself as the one running the operation. You weren't afraid, he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. I was afraid every day, she said. I was afraid when your guard came toward me. I was afraid when you got out of the car yourself. She looked at him steadily. But you do things when you're afraid. You just do them afraid. He looked at her for a long time. On the couch, Elizabeth had opened her eyes. He didn't know when she had moved from her resting stillness to wakefulness at some point during the conversation, and was now looking at the ceiling with the expression of a woman listening to something she had been waiting to hear confirmed. She didn't turn her head. She didn't indicate that she was present. She gave the room to her daughter. Siok stood, crossed to the window and looked at the garden. The light was doing what it had been doing, paying attention to the bounded space, making it specific. A tree in the garden's corner, bare in the late season, its branches holding the light without keeping it. Is this his last chance at redemption? He had stopped believing in redemption at 31. He had stopped believing in it the way you stop believing in a route when the road ends, not as a philosophical position, but as a practical conclusion based on available evidence. The evidence had been comprehensive. He had compiled it himself. The evidence was now under revision. Not because a child had told him something he hadn't known. He had known, somewhere beneath the machine, every element of what she had just articulated. He had known the arithmetic existed. He had known the receipts were accumulating. What she had done was not inform him. What she had done was something more specific and more costly. She had looked at the version of him that the photograph contained, the version that cried at funerals for men his orders had made fatherless, and she had treated it as the real version, as the one worth walking across a city for. Being seen accurately by someone, with no reason to lie about it, was not something the machine had a protocol for. He turned from the window. "I need to leave," he said. "There's something that has to be finished tonight." He looked at Martina. "You stay here. You don't open the door for anyone. My man is in the kitchen and he stays in the kitchen." He held her gaze. "When I come back, your mother will have proper care. Not the Yumpyeong facility somewhere Choi has never touched. I've already identified it. It's already arranged." Martina looked at him with the wide, still eyes. "You're going to his building," she said. Not a question. The 14 months of wall notations had given her enough of Choi's geography to map the shape of what was coming. "Yes. He'll have more men than you. He usually does." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached into the pocket of her blue shirt and produced the locket. She held it out to him across the room, not standing, not crossing to him, simply extending her arm with the locket in her open palm the way she had on the street in Apgujeong, 7 years old and certain. He crossed the room, looked at the locket in her hand. "You should keep that," he said. She shook her head. "You need it more tonight." He looked at her. He looked at the locket. He looked at the 3 engraved characters on its face, the name of the first man he had ever ordered removed, the man whose sister was breathing carefully on the couch behind them, whose niece was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her arm extended, and her chin level, and the constitutional thoroughness of someone who has decided this is the correct action and is waiting for the receiving party to catch up. He took the locket. It was lighter than he remembered, or he was holding it differently. He put it in his inside pocket, against his chest, where the photograph of Elizabeth had been. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Martina once more, at the girl who had seen a seam in a blurred photograph and pulled the whole wall through it. "You do things when you're afraid," he said. "You just do them afraid." She nodded, once, the way she did everything. In the city of wolves, a lamb had been keeping score. And the king was walking back into his kingdom with a dead man's locket over his heart and a 7-year-old's testimony in his pocket, and the specific, irreversible clarity of a man who has finally read all his own receipts. He was at the door when Elizabeth spoke. "Jium Bayum Siok," still looking at the ceiling, voice even, the register she had decided on and maintained. He stopped. "Come back," she said. Not a plea, an instruction, delivered with the same precision as everything else she had said to him, by a woman who had spent 19 years arriving at this room and intended to be present for what came after it. He left without answering, but he closed the door carefully, the way you close a door on something you intend to return to. Outside, the Yumpyeong-gu street was narrow and quiet, and the light was doing what light does in late afternoon, running low, making shadows long, turning the ordinary into something that knows it's running out of time. His verified contact was waiting at the end of the street with 2 others. The Siacho building was 22 minutes away. Choi had been in it for 4 hours. The last stand wasn't coming. It was already there, assembled and waiting, in the building whose name was on Baeum-seok's documents and whose weight he had decided, somewhere between a garden window and a dead man's locket. He was no longer willing to carry the way he had been carrying it. He walked toward the car. The locket was against his chest. It felt, in the cold air of the late afternoon, like something with a temperature, like something that had been waiting 19 years to be warm again. The rain arrived at 8:47. Not gradually, Seoul rain in late season does not negotiate its arrival. It came in full, immediate, the kind of rain that erases the distinction between street and sky and turns the city into a place that is happening entirely in the present tense. Baeum-seok stood at the service entrance of the Siacho building and felt it on the back of his neck and on the shoulders of his jacket and did not move to shelter because there was no shelter that was relevant to what he was about to do. His verified contact, the first name on the 3-name list, a man called Woo who had been with him longer than Jihun and had never given him a reason to reconsider, stood to his left. The 2 others were positioned at the building's secondary access points, not enough for a siege, precisely enough for what this actually was. Choi has 7 men inside, Woo said, not a warning. An operational fact, delivered in the tone of someone who had already processed its implications and was conveying data rather than concern. 3 on the executive floor, 2 at the stairwell access, 2 at the main entrance. Jihun. Still in the conference room where you left him. Choi's men have the corridor, but they haven't entered. Baeum-seok looked at the building, his building. 20 years of decisions made inside it, in rooms whose coordinates he knew the way he knew the lines of the ink on his neck, not by looking, but by the specific weight of their presence. He knew every corridor, every stairwell, every room that had a second exit and every room that didn't and why. He had designed the second exits himself. The executive floor, he said. Choi will be in my office. Yes. Of course he would. Choi had the theatrical instinct of a man who understood that location communicated authority. Sitting in Baeum-seok's chair, behind Baeum-seok's desk, in the room with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city 30 stories below, this was not logistics. This was a statement about who the room belonged to now. Baeum-seok checked his sidearm, chambered safetied, put it back. Stay at access points, he said to Woo. Nobody enters or exits without my clearance. If anything moves at the Yunpyonggu house, anything, you call me before you breathe. Woo nodded. Then, in the rain, with the specific brevity of a man who rarely spent words on things that didn't require them. Sir, whatever happens up there, the organization doesn't end with the building. Baeum-seok looked at him. I know, he said. He went inside. The service elevator. The maintenance corridor on the 28th floor that connected to the executive level's secondary access. The door at the corridor's end that was on no building schematic Choi had ever been shown, because it predated Choi's tenure and Baeum-seok had kept it off the documentation with the specific foresight of someone who always built the way out before he needed it. He moved through the building the way he had always moved through difficult spaces, without announcing himself, without haste, with the focused economy of someone who had learned long ago that noise was a liability and stillness was a weapon. The stairwell access on 28 had 2 of Choi's men. He heard them before the door, assessed the voices, moved past through the maintenance corridor instead. The secondary door opened onto the executive level's east side, 15 meters from his office entrance. He stood in the east corridor and listened. Choi's 3 men on the executive floor were distributed the way competent people distributed in an unfamiliar space, 2 covering the primary approach, 1 at the office door itself. He could hear the one at the door shifting weight. Subtle, the particular restlessness of someone who has been stationary for 4 hours and is beginning to question the timeline. Baeum-seok moved to the first of the 2, covering the primary approach before the man heard him coming. The second one turned at the sound and found Baeum-seok already between them, which was an uncomfortable geometry that resolved quickly in Baeum-seok's favor. The one at the office door made his decision, reached for his weapon, and discovered that the distance was not in his favor. 30 seconds, the corridor was quiet again. He straightened his jacket, put his hand on the office door, pushed it open. Choi was not behind the desk. This was the first thing Baeum-seok registered, that the theatrical instinct he had anticipated had been subordinated to something more tactically sound. Choi was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room, looking at the rain-obscured city below. Gray suit, as always, the color of something that had decided to be neither one thing nor the other. He had a glass in his hand. Scotch from the decanter on the cabinet, Baeum-seok's scotch, which was either the theatrical instinct finding a smaller venue or simply the action of a man who had been waiting for 4 hours and wanted a drink. He spoke without turning. "I wondered which entrance," he said. "I guess the main." "I know." Baeum-seok let the door close behind him. "That's why I used the other one." Choi turned. His face was the face of a man who had been preparing for this moment for 8 months, composed, settled into its own certainty the way a prepared argument settles. He was 53 years old, precise in his movements, cold in his affect in the way that had always been a performance of coldness rather than the thing itself. Baeum-seok had known this for years. He had found it useful. A man performing coldness was predictable in a way that genuine coldness wasn't. "You pulled 3 of my men out of the clinic," Choi said, "and walked a dying woman through a service alley." He looked at Baeum-seok with the expression of someone presenting evidence. "For a child whose name you didn't know 8 days ago." 7 days. "Does the correction matter?" "Precision matters. You taught me that." Choi set the glass down on the window ledge. "I taught you a great deal, including what happens to leaders who mistake sentiment for strategy." He moved away from the window, toward the center of the room, not toward Baeum-seok, laterally, the way you move when you are redistributing the geometry of a space. "The organization is watching this. Every decision you've made in the last 7 days has been watched and measured and found to be the decisions of a man who has lost the primary qualification." "Which is?" "The ability to calculate without interference." He stopped. "She's interference. The mother is interference. Everything that has happened since that girl appeared behind your motorcade has been interference, and you have let it determine your movements, your resources, your security protocols." His voice carried the specific temperature of a man who believes he is being reasonable in a conversation that others have made unreasonable. "I was protecting the organization." "You were protecting your version of it." "They're the same thing." "No," Baeum-seok said. "They were the same thing. 8 months ago they diverged. You chose not to tell me." Something moved through Choi's face, not guilt. He was past guilt, but the recognition of a man who has been accurately described. "You wouldn't have listened." "Probably not." He held Choi's gaze. "I'm listening now." "Does the king lose his crown today?" The room held the question in its silence. The rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass made a sound like sustained static. The city outside rendered abstract, dissolved into gray and water, everything reduced to the 2 men and the space between them and the 20 years of architecture that space contained. Choi looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved his right hand, a signal precise, the kind that travels through walls to people waiting on the other side of them. The office door opened. 2 of Choi's remaining men entered. Behind them, not restrained but flanked, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has assessed a situation fully and is currently furious about it in a way she has decided not to display, Nurse Hana. The clinic coordinator from Yongdungpo, the woman who had locked room 4's door and bought time with the front desk, and had apparently been collected at some point in the preceding hours as a contingency. "She was helpful this morning," Choi said. "Inadvertently, she confirmed the transfer arrangements." He looked at Baeum-seok with the expression of a man playing a complete hand. "I don't need the child. I don't need the mother. I need you to understand what it costs to be distracted." He gestured toward Nurse Hana. "This is a demonstration, nothing more. You resume operations on the organization's terms. This woman goes home." Baeum-seok looked at Nurse Hana. She looked back at him with eyes that contained, in roughly equal measure, terror, and the iron-spined resolution of someone who had been terrified before and had continued working anyway. She had coordinated with him to care for a patient she was frightened of being connected to. She had locked a door on his instruction at 7 in the morning without knowing whether he would arrive in time. She was standing between two of Choi's men in his office in the rain, and her jaw was set at an angle that reminded him, with a precision that landed somewhere behind his sternum, of a 7-year-old on a sunlit pavement. He looked at Choi. He looked at the gun at Choi's hip, visible now, the jacket adjusted when he signaled the door. He looked at his own hand, where the sidearm was accessible in under 2 seconds, which was a calculation his body had made automatically and his mind noted without acting on. He looked at the window, at the rain, at the city dissolving in it. Can mercy win in a world of vengeance? He had built the world. He had designed it from the inside with the specific architecture of a man who understood that vengeance was sustainable and mercy was a structural weakness. He had made it work. For 20 years he had made it work, and the proof was the desk and the chair and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city below that ran its logistics in reference to his name. He reached into his jacket. Choi's hand moved to his hip. Seok removed the locket, set it on the desk between them. Then he reached back in and removed his sidearm, slowly, with the deliberate visibility of someone who needs the action to be unambiguous, and set it on the desk beside the locket. The room went very still. Choi stared at the desk. At the gun and the tarnished locket side by side on the surface of the desk, he had spent 8 months maneuvering to occupy. His hand was still at his hip. His face was performing its coldness with slightly less conviction than it had been 60 seconds ago. "This is what you think mercy looks like," Choi said. The certainty in his voice had developed a fracture line. Not fear, Choi was not afraid of him, which had always been one of Choi's more significant miscalculations. Something else. The specific disorientation of a prepared argument meeting a response it wasn't built for. "I think mercy looks like whatever comes after this," Seok said. "I don't know what that is yet." He looked at Nurse Hana. "She leaves now. Her involvement ends here. If anything reaches her after tonight, professionally, personally, in any form, the documentation Martina assembled on your parallel operation goes to every relevant authority simultaneously. You've seen 14 months of that documentation. You know what it contains." Choi was very still. "You're trading the organization," he said, "for a nurse." "I'm drawing a line," Seok said. "You can call it whatever helps you understand it." The ink on his neck felt like it was being rewritten, like thorns becoming something that had not yet decided what it was. Choi looked at the gun on the desk, at the locket, at Seok standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows with the rain behind him and his hands empty and his face. For the first time in 20 years, in this room, in this city, not a closed door. Something in Choi's architecture shifted. Seok watched it happen. Watched the 8 months of careful construction encounter a foundation it hadn't accounted for and begin the slow, structural process of reassessing what it was built on. "The organization won't follow this," Choi said, quieter now, the argument finding its last position. "Some of it won't," Seok agreed. "The part that does is the part worth keeping." A long silence. The rain sustained itself against the glass. Choi looked at his 2 men, then at Nurse Hana, then at the desk. At the locket specifically, at the tarnished silver of it, the 3 engraved characters, the broken chain coiled beneath it. He looked at it with an expression Seok had not seen on him before and could not fully categorize. Recognition, possibly. The specific recognition of a man encountering something he had decided did not exist. He gestured to his men. A different signal from the previous one, smaller, resigned in the precise way that a decision is resigned when it has been made by someone who has run out of the specific resource required to continue the argument. They stepped away from Nurse Hana. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back and looked at Seok with the iron-spined expression that had not left her face once in the preceding minutes. "The patient," she said. "Elizabeth, whatever happens tonight, she needs the specialist from Severance Hospital. The one on the third referral list. No one else. Then she left. Choi looked at the empty doorway, then at Bayam Seok. "You dropped your gun," he said, as if confirming an observed fact for his own records. "Yes." "In front of your own men, in front of mine." "Yes." Choi picked up the Scotch glass from the window ledge, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. When he turned back, something in his face had completed a process that had apparently been running since the locket appeared on the desk. "The protege deposing the mentor," he said. "I had the entire sequence planned, every contingency." He looked at Bayam Seok with an expression that was, stripped of its architecture, simply tired. "I didn't plan for you to put the gun down." "Nobody does," Bayam Seok said. "That's why it works." Choi was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific economy of a man who has made a decision he won't explain further. "The Western District operation. I'll dismantle it. On my timeline." "My timeline," Bayam Seok said. "Wu will coordinate, you'll cooperate." A pause that contained a man, measuring what he had left against what he was being asked to concede. "And the organization's future," Choi said. "What does it look like on your timeline, after a king drops his gun in his own office?" Bayam Seok picked up the locket from the desk, the gun he left. "Different," he said, "from everything we built it to be." He walked to the door, his hand on the frame, the rain still against the windows, the city still dissolving in it. "Choi." The man looked at him. "You lost your family to my rivals," Bayam Seok said. "I know, I've known for years." He held his gaze. "I should have said something about it before tonight. That's on me." He left Choi standing in the office with the gun on the desk, and the empty Scotch glass, and the city behind him that neither of them had ever fully owned, despite all evidence to the contrary. In the corridor, Wu was waiting. His face asked the question without words. "It's done," Bayam Seok said. "Get Hana home safe, then call the specialist at Severance Hospital." He moved toward the elevator. "Tell them the patient's name is Elizabeth Benjamin. Tell them it's tonight." The locket was in his fist. He held it the way Martina had held it, closed, certain, carrying something that needed to arrive somewhere. He had one more place to be. The rain stops. Elizabeth doesn't make it to morning. And in the quiet of a house in Yunpyonggu, the most feared man in Seoul finds out what's left of him when everything he used the fear to avoid finally arrives all at once. The rain stopped at 11:14. Bayam Seok knew the exact time because he was standing in the small, walled garden of the Yunpyonggu house when it happened. Present for the precise moment, the city's sustained noise shifted from rain on everything to the specific, clarified quiet that follows rain, when the air is rinsed and the surfaces are bright, and the world has the quality of something recently reconsidered. He had been in the garden for 6 minutes. He had come outside, because the inside of the house had a quality he needed to be adjacent to rather than inside of. The severance specialist had arrived at 10:22. A woman, 50s, with the particular compressed authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult things clear without making them cruel. She had assessed Elizabeth in 14 minutes and had spoken to Bayam Seok afterward in the corridor with the directness he had requested by saying nothing that indicated he wanted anything other than directness. The timeline, she said, was not a timeline anymore. It was a matter of hours. The condition had progressed beyond the point where the specialist from Severance or anyone else represented a variable rather than a witness. He had thanked her. She had looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating the expected response and finding it absent. Then she had gone back inside to sit with Elizabeth, which was apparently what she did, sat with people at the end of the timeline, because someone had to, and she had decided long ago that she was someone. Bayam Seok had gone to the garden. Martina was with her mother. He had looked in once, through the sitting room doorway before coming outside. The room was quiet, the lamp low, the specialist in the chair at the room's edge giving the space its necessary center. Elizabeth was on the couch. They had moved her from the bedroom at her instruction, because she wanted the window, wanted the garden visible, wanted the bounded specific light of it even in the dark. Martina was beside her in the position she had occupied all day, on the floor, close enough that her shoulder touched the blanket, the coverless book closed on her knee, her mother's hand held in both of hers. Elizabeth was talking, quietly, continuously, in the way of someone using the time they have left with the precision of someone who has been thinking about how to use it. Martina was listening with her whole body, the particular quality of attention that is so complete it becomes visible. Siak had looked for 30 seconds. Then he had come to the garden. He stood in the wet garden in his suit with the rain stopped, and the city's clarified quiet around him, and the locket in his right hand, and thought about nothing in the specific deliberate way you think about nothing when thinking about something is not yet survivable. He had been in this position before, the aftermath of decisions. The rooms after the arithmetic completed itself, and the result was permanent, and the ledger moved on. He had a protocol for it, the machine engaged, the next operational sequence initialized, the irrevocable filed in the category of concluded matters, and the attention redirected to what remained actionable. He ran the protocol. It didn't run. He stood in the wet garden and tried to initialize the next sequence, and found that the mechanism that had been doing this for 20 years was not unavailable or damaged, but simply uninterested. As if it had completed a function and determined that the function was finished and had no instructions set for what came after. The locket was in his fist. He held it the way Martina had held it, closed, certain, carrying something. He had been carrying it for 7 days. He had been carrying the thing underneath it for 19 years. The tattoo on his neck felt like it had always felt, in the honest hours, like a record of something he had written on himself before he understood what he was writing, like a document he couldn't revoke. The specialist came to the garden door at 11:51. She stood in the doorway and looked at him across the small, wet space, and her expression carried the information before she spoke it. She spoke it anyway, because clarity was what she offered, and she offered it completely. "She's gone," she said. It was quiet. Martina was holding her hand. He looked at the garden wall, at the bare tree in the corner, whose branches had been holding the light all day and were now holding the dark in the same way, without keeping it, without resisting its passage. "The child," he said, his voice was level, the machine's final service. "How is she?" "Sitting with her." A pause. "She asked for you." He looked at the specialist. She looked back with the expression she had, the one that did not flinch from the weight of a room and did not pretend the weight wasn't there. He went inside. The sitting room was the same room it had been an hour ago. The lamp, the low light, the window with the garden visible. The couch, the blanket. Elizabeth, who had arranged herself in life with such deliberate precision and had, according to the specialist, maintained that quality to the end, present, specific, paying attention to what she illuminated. She looked in the lamp's low light, like the woman in the photograph, the one smiling for the child behind the camera. The smile was gone now, but the face was the same face, and it held in its stillness the specific dignity of someone who had made all their choices and stood behind them. Martina was on the floor. She had not moved from her position. Her mother's hand was still held in both of hers, resting on the blanket's edge. She was looking at her mother's face with the same focused, complete attention she had brought to everything, to the wall notations, to the motorcade, to the locket in her open palm on a sunlit street. The same quality, directed now at something that did not require strategy or research or the courage to approach a dangerous man. Just presence, just the staying. Siak crossed the room. He sat on the floor beside her, not in the chair, not at any managed distance. On the floor, the way she was on the floor, which put him at her level and made the room a different room than it would have been from any other position. Martina did not look at him. She continued looking at her mother. He sat beside her and did not speak. The room held them. The lamp held its light. The garden was visible through the window, wet and bounded and specific. Where does the Mafia boss go now? He had no answer. He had the protocol, and the protocol was not running, and beneath the protocol, in the space that the machine had been covering for 2 decades, there was simply what had always been there. What he had put the machine there to manage. The original material. The thing that existed before the suit and the ink and the throne of glass and the 20 years of clean arithmetic. A boy who had followed a boss through a city once. Small, certain, carrying something he couldn't name but wouldn't put down, who had stood in doorways and looked at rooms that contained things he wanted and had learned, over years of learning the wrong things, to convert one into acquisition and call the result power. He looked at Martina, at her hands holding her mother's, at the coverless book on the floor beside her, at the scratch on her cheekbone healing, at the blue shirt, the same blue shirt, washed at some point in the last 7 days by someone in the house and dried and put back on because it was hers and she kept what was hers. She had not cried yet. He could see the structure of it in her face, the enormous, contained thing that was present and had not yet found its way out. The specific held quality of someone who has been holding things together for so long that the holding is still running on momentum even when the reason for it has changed. He knew the quality intimately. He had been holding things together for 20 years, past the reason for it. Martina turned and looked at him. She looked at him with the wide, dark eyes that had stared through his motorcade window and down the barrel of his composure and into the blurred edge of a funeral photograph. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with the complete, undeflected attention of someone who had decided he was worth looking at clearly. And then, for the first time in 7 days, the steadiness broke. Not dramatically, not the way things break in rooms built for drama. The way things break when they have been held precisely and carefully for exactly as long as they could be held, and then the holding simply concludes. Her face changed, the specific change of a child's face when the adult architecture it has been borrowing finally returns to its proper owners, and what remains is 7 years old, and has just lost its mother, and is sitting on the floor of a stranger's house in a city that has been indifferent to it for 14 months. She made a sound he had no category for. And Bayam Siak, who had built his organization on the elimination of every response that was not operational, who had spent 20 years converting the original material of himself into something that could not be reached by the things that reach people, put his arms around her. It was not a considered action. It was not a protocol or a decision or a calculated gesture toward the management of a situation. It was what his body did when a child in a blue shirt made that sound in a room where her mother was gone, and the lamp was low, and the garden was wet and bounded, and the city outside was entirely indifferent. She pressed her face into his jacket. Both hands, still, released her mother's hand and held his lapels instead, the way she had reached for the sides of the world when the world required holding. And then something happened that had not happened in 20 years. Not since a specific room, a specific night, a specific circumstance he did not revisit. Not since before the ink and the machine and the arithmetic and the throne. Not in any corridor, any negotiation, any cold decision in any lit room above any city. Jihun Bayam Siak, the most feared man in Seoul, came apart. Not loudly. Not in any way that the city outside would have recognized as the sound of its own architecture shifting. Quietly, in a low-lit room in Yunpyeonggu, with a 7-year-old's hands holding his lapels and her face against his jacket, the thing he had been covering for 20 years surfaced without permission and without the possibility of redirection. He held her, and she held him, and the room held both of them, and none of it was operational. The specialist had left the room. He did not know when. He became aware of her absence only as a perimeter fact. The room contained 2 people, and the lamp, and the garden in the window, and Elizabeth, who had arranged herself with such precision, and was now simply present in the way that the permanent are present, which is different from any other kind. Who is the real leader in this duo? She had been the leader since Apgujeongrow, since the locket on the sunlit pavement, since she looked at a blurred funeral photograph and identified the seam and decided to pull it. She had been running the operation from the moment she opened her fist, and he had been catching up 1 chapter at a time, 1 receipt at a time, 1 room at a time, to the place she had already mapped and was waiting in. She had known where this went. She had known before she started walking. He understood this now, on the floor of the sitting room, with the coverless book beside them and the locket in his closed fist, and the city rinsed clean outside. She had not come to him for protection. She had come to complete a circuit, to bring the consequence back to its origin, and see what the origin did when it was faced with the full accounting. What it did was this. What it did was hold her. They stayed on the floor for a long time. The lamp burned. The garden darkened. The city made its sounds, indifferent as always, which was not cruelty. The city's indifference was simply what cities were, and there was a kind of honesty in it that rooms could not provide. At some point, Martina's breathing changed. The specific shift from acute grief to the exhaustion that follows it, the body concluding its immediate emergency and beginning the longer work of carrying what remains. Her grip on his lapels did not loosen. It changed character. Less holding against the current, more simply holding. He looked at the top of her head, at the bun that had maintained its position through 7 days of crawl spaces and service alleys and clinic corridors and rain. 2 strands escaped near her left ear, the same 2 that had been escaping since Apgujeongro, and no one had put them back, and no one was going to put them back, and this specific fact arrived in him with a weight that had no operational category and needed none. He would put them back, not now, later when the room allowed for it. He would learn what that required and he would do it because it needed doing and he was the one who was here. What becomes of the empire? He had been building toward an answer since he dropped his gun on the desk in the Siacho office. The foundation had been laid in a garden while the rain stopped. The structure had taken shape on a sitting room floor in Yunpyonggu. What he had built for 20 years, the throne, the silence, the machine, would become something different. Not immediately. Not cleanly. Change of that scale moved through an organization the way water moved through concrete, slowly, at the pressure points, finding the places that were already prepared to give. Wu would coordinate the dismantling. Choi would cooperate or not. That was now Choi's variable to manage. The documentation on the wall, all 17 pages transcribed and verified, would determine what remained of the parallel structure and how it was addressed. The Foundation Bayamsiok had already begun planning for families affected by syndicate operations, bearing a name he had not yet decided on, but knew would not be his own, would begin with the resources he had spent 20 years accumulating for a different purpose. These were decisions for tomorrow, for the week after tomorrow, for the version of him that would get up from this floor and walk back into the city with different instructions. Tonight was not for decisions. Tonight was for staying on the floor. Martina shifted, tilted her head back to look up at him. Her eyes were wet, but the steadiness was already returning, not armoring back over, not the held quality of before. Something new, something that had been through the breaking and was on the other side of it, which was different from having never broken. She looked at his face. She looked at it the way she had looked at the funeral photograph, searching for the seam, finding it, looking at what was behind it without looking away. "You're going to stay," she said. Not a question. The same register as everything she said, gathered, certain, delivered to land. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment longer, the way she studied things, completely, without performance. Then she turned back toward her mother, settled against his side, put her head against his arm. Her hands released his lapels and rearranged themselves in her lap, folded, the gesture he recognized as her mother's. He looked at Elizabeth, at the woman who had survived 19 years of consequence with her clarity intact and her daughter's judgment sound, and her final instruction delivered with the same precision as everything else she had ever said to him. "Come back." He was back. The lamp burned. The garden was wet and bounded, and the bare tree in its corner held the dark without keeping it. The city outside made its indifferent sounds. In the morning, there would be the work. The foundation, the organization's restructuring, the questions that had no clean answers and would require the kind of sustained attention that he had spent 20 years directing at the wrong problems. There would be a girl to raise in a city he had built on the wrong materials, and the raising would require him to become something the machine had no specifications for. He did not know exactly what that was yet. He knew he was going to find out. The locket was still in his fist. He opened his hand and looked at it, the tarnished silver, the 3 characters, the broken chain. Michael Benjamin, who had been 41 and had a sister and had stood between Bayam Siak and something he wanted, and had therefore ceased to be a person in Bayam Siak's accounting. He would be a person now. In the Foundation's name, in its work, in the sustained attention Bayam Siak intended to bring to the human wreckage the arithmetic had produced. Not as payment. There was no payment for this. As acknowledgement. As the only thing that could be done with a receipt once you had finally read it in full. He closed his fist again, held it. Beside him, Martina breathed. In and out. Steady the way she was steady, not because nothing had happened, but because she had decided to be steady after everything had happened, which was the only kind of steadiness that meant anything. Outside, Seoul continued. The empire continued, for now, in its altered form, moving toward what it would become. The city made its sounds. And on the floor of a sitting room in Yunpyonggu, the most feared man in Seoul sat with a 7-year-old girl against his side and held a dead man's locket, and let the night do what the night needed to do. He had spent 20 years refusing to be reached. It had taken 7 days, a blue shirt, and a broken locket to find the door. It had taken 1 night, on a sitting room floor, to walk through it. She wasn't asking for his money. She was asking for his soul. And somewhere in the space between a sunlit pavement and a low-lit room, between an open fist and a closed one, between the king he had been and the man he was becoming, he had given it. Willingly, without condition, in full. This is the end of the story of a man who built a throne of glass and a girl who knew, from a blurred photograph taken at a funeral he had no right to cry at, that the glass had a crack in it. She found the crack. She put her small, certain hands on it. And she waited, with the patience of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to offer, for the light to come through. Before we close this story, pause here for just a moment, because what you just witnessed has a name outside of fiction. Psychologists call it affect isolation, a survival mechanism where the mind learns to disconnect emotional response from action in order to function through sustained trauma or moral injury. It is documented in soldiers, in abuse survivors, in people who have spent years in environments where feeling was a liability. The mind builds the machine because the machine protects. But protection, sustained long enough, becomes its own kind of damage. What Martina did, identifying a single unguarded moment in a photograph, treating it as evidence of something recoverable, and building her entire approach around that evidence, is exactly what trained, trauma-informed therapists are taught to look for. The crack in the armor. The one place the isolation didn't fully seal, because it never fully seals. In 20 years of clinical research on emotional shutdown, the consistent finding is this: the capacity for connection does not die. It goes underground, and it waits. Bayam Siak didn't break because he was weak. He broke because something survived in him that was stronger than everything he built on top of it. If you recognize that mechanism in yourself or in someone you love, the machine that runs so someone doesn't have to feel, know that what Martina knew. The crack is not a flaw. The crack is the way back in. Reach toward it, or find someone trained to help you find it. Because the floor of a sitting room and the arms of someone who stayed, that's not just a story. That's what recovery actually looks like.